Maria Santos Rivera died on a Tuesday morning in her suburban Los Angeles home while her husband was at work and her children were at school. The 38-year-old Filipina-American housewife was stabbed 17 times in her own kitchen by someone she knew intimately, someone who had been inside her home dozens of times before, someone whose mother lived just 3 houses down the quiet, tree-lined street. The weapon was a knife from Maria's own kitchen block, a wedding gift from 15 years earlier. Her blood soaked into the white tile floor she had mopped just the day before, spreading beneath the refrigerator covered with her children's artwork and family photos from happier times. When her husband Robert found her body 6 hours later, the scene was so horrific that the first responding officer, a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, had to step outside to compose himself before securing the crime scene. This is the story of how an affair born from loneliness, nurtured in secret, and ending in rejection, became a brutal murder that destroyed 2 families and shattered the illusion of safety in a close-knit Filipino-American community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. The neighborhood of Cypress Park in northeast Los Angeles, where Maria Santos Rivera lived and died, looked like the embodiment of the American dream for immigrant families who had worked hard to achieve middle-class stability. Wide streets lined with mature jacaranda trees, well-maintained single-family homes with neat lawns and American flags hanging from front porches, minivans parked in driveways, children's bicycles left on sidewalks. This was not the Los Angeles of Hollywood glamour or gang violence that dominated news coverage. This was the Los Angeles of working families, of parents who left for work before dawn and returned after dark, of kids who walked to the local elementary school in groups, of weekends spent at backyard barbecues and birthday parties where everyone in the neighborhood was invited. The area had a significant Filipino-American population, drawn by affordable housing and the presence of family members who had immigrated decades earlier. On any given Sunday, you could walk down Cypress Avenue and smell adobo cooking in half a dozen kitchens, hear Tagalog being spoken on front porches, see groups of men playing basketball at the local park while their wives caught up on community gossip. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still looked out for each other, where elderly neighbors had their groceries carried inside by teenage boys, where block parties were organized through group text messages and everyone contributed food. The Santos Rivera family had lived on Cypress Avenue for 12 years, moving in when Maria was pregnant with their second child. They were considered pillars of the local Filipino community. Robert Rivera worked as an IT manager at a downtown firm, often putting in 60-hour weeks to support his family and maintain their comfortable lifestyle. Maria was involved in everything at their church, organizing fundraisers, coordinating the children's choir, hosting prayer groups at their home. Their 2 children, 14-year-old Joshua and 11-year-old Emily, were excellent students who participated in multiple extracurricular activities. To their neighbors, the Riveras represented success and stability. No one suspected that behind the perfectly maintained facade, Maria was desperately lonely, feeling invisible in her own home, and seeking connection in the most dangerous place possible, just 3 houses down the street. Maria Santos was born in Manila, Philippines, in a modest neighborhood where large families lived in small houses and everyone's business was known to everyone else. She was the eldest of 4 children, raised in a traditional Catholic household where her mother taught her that a woman's primary purpose was to serve her family, that marriage was forever, and that personal happiness came second to duty and obligation. Maria was a bright, ambitious girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, who loved to read, who wanted to see the world beyond the crowded streets of her neighborhood. She finished high school with excellent grades and began attending a local college, working part-time at a restaurant to help pay tuition and contribute to her family's expenses. It was at that restaurant, a place that catered to American tourists and business travelers, where she met Robert Rivera. He was a second-generation Filipino-American, born and raised in Los Angeles, working in Manila for 6 months on a technology project for his company. Robert was handsome, confident, spoke English with an American accent, and represented everything Maria associated with opportunity and a better life. He was kind to her, tipped generously, and always asked about her studies. Their courtship was brief but intense. Robert extended his stay in Manila by 3 months, taking Maria to nice restaurants, movies, shopping trips to malls where she had only window shopped before. He talked about life in America, about opportunities for advancement, about the Filipino community in Los Angeles that would make her feel at home. He asked her to marry him after 5 months, promising to sponsor her immigration to the United States. Maria's mother approved of the match, seeing it as a chance for her daughter to have a better life and potentially help the rest of the family immigrate eventually. Maria was 23 when she married Robert in a small ceremony in Manila, 24 when she arrived in Los Angeles with a green card and high hopes for her new life in America. The reality of immigration was harder than she had imagined. She missed her family desperately, struggled with homesickness, found the sprawling city of Los Angeles overwhelming and impersonal compared to the tight-knit community she had left behind. Robert worked long hours, leaving early and returning late, often too tired to do much more than eat dinner and watch television. Maria found herself alone in their small apartment most days, without friends, without family, without the support system she had always known. When she became pregnant with Joshua 6 months after arriving in the United States, she was thrilled to have a purpose and focus. Motherhood gave her days structure and meaning, but it also increased her isolation. Robert's career advanced rapidly, requiring longer hours and frequent travel. By the time Emily was born 2 years later, they had moved to the house on Cypress Avenue in a neighborhood with other Filipino families, and Maria had found a community through the local Catholic church. She threw herself into being the perfect wife and mother, cooking elaborate meals, keeping an immaculate home, volunteering at her children's schools, organizing community events. From the outside, her life looked full and successful. Inside, Maria felt increasingly empty. She loved her children fiercely, but as they grew older and more independent, she felt her purpose shrinking. She loved Robert, or at least the memory of the man he had been in Manila, but their emotional connection had eroded over years of him being physically present but emotionally distant. Maria was 38 years old, living in a beautiful home, married to a successful husband, raising 2 wonderful children, and feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She wanted to be seen, to be desired, to feel like a woman instead of just a wife and mother. That vulnerability, that hunger for connection and validation, would make her susceptible to attention from the most dangerous possible source. The Rivera marriage had started with genuine affection and optimism, but had slowly calcified into a partnership focused on practical matters rather than emotional intimacy. Robert was not a bad husband by most conventional measures. He was faithful, worked hard to provide financial security, never raised his voice or his hand, attended important family functions, and was involved with his children when his schedule allowed. But he was emotionally unavailable in ways that left Maria feeling like a housekeeper and childcare provider, rather than a partner and lover. They had not had a meaningful conversation about anything other than household logistics or the children's activities in months, possibly years. Their physical relationship had become perfunctory and infrequent, occurring maybe once a month when both happened to be awake and in bed at the same time, which was rare given Robert's habit of working late and falling asleep on the couch. Maria could not remember the last time Robert had asked her how she was feeling, what she was thinking, what she dreamed about. She could not remember the last time he had really looked at her, seeing her as Maria and not just as his wife who kept the household running. The distance between them had grown so gradually that neither had noticed how far apart they had drifted. Robert saw himself as a good provider who was sacrificing time with his family to ensure their financial security and his children's futures. He worked 60-hour weeks, traveled for business, took on additional projects for promotions and raises. In his mind, he was demonstrating love through provision. What he did not see was his wife's increasing loneliness, her need for emotional connection, her hunger to feel desired and appreciated. Maria tried to communicate her feelings several times over the years, but these conversations always ended the same way. Robert would promise to work less, to spend more time at home, to be more present. He would follow through for a few days or weeks, then slowly slip back into his old patterns. Eventually, Maria stopped trying. She told herself that this was simply what marriage looked like after 15 years, that expecting passion and romance was childish and unrealistic, that she should be grateful for a stable home and a faithful husband. She buried her dissatisfaction deep inside, where it festered and grew into resentment she barely acknowledged even to herself. Financial pressures added stress to an already strained relationship. Despite Robert's good income, the cost of living in Los Angeles was crushing. The mortgage payment, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance on their house consumed a significant portion of Robert's salary. There were also the costs of raising 2 children in an expensive city, school supplies and fees, sports and music lessons, healthcare, clothing, food, and the constant pressure to keep up with other families in the neighborhood. Maria felt guilty spending money on herself, rarely buying new clothes or personal items, cutting her own hair to save the cost of salon visits. Every dollar spent had to be justified, weighed against the family's needs and future expenses. This constant financial pressure meant that Robert felt he could not afford to work less, that he had to pursue every opportunity for advancement and additional income. It also meant that Maria felt trapped. She had considered getting a job to contribute financially and to have something for herself outside the home. But the income she could earn with her limited work experience and education would barely cover childcare costs. Robert was not opposed to her working, but he also made it clear that it could not interfere with her primary responsibilities of managing the household and caring for the children. Maria felt caught between the traditional expectations she had been raised with and the reality of modern life where most families needed 2 incomes. The cultural dynamics of their relationship added another layer of complexity. Maria had been raised with very traditional ideas about gender roles and marriage. A good wife supported her husband's career, maintained a beautiful home, raised obedient children, and did not complain about her lot in life. She knew that if she talked to her mother or older relatives about her unhappiness, they would tell her she was being ungrateful, that she had a good life by any reasonable standard, that marriage required sacrifice and compromise. Robert, despite being American-born, had absorbed many of these same cultural values from his own parents. He expected dinner on the table when he got home, a clean house, well-behaved children, and a wife who managed all the domestic responsibilities without burdening him with complaints. This dynamic had worked for his parents' generation, but it left Maria feeling like she was living in the 1950s while watching other women her age pursuing careers, traveling, having adventures. She loved her children and did not regret the choice to focus on family, but she also felt like she had disappeared into her roles as wife and mother, losing any sense of herself as an individual. By the spring of the year she would die, Maria's marriage had become a hollow shell. She and Robert were roommates who shared financial obligations and parenting duties, but had no emotional or physical intimacy. They did not fight because fighting would have required caring enough to be angry. They simply existed in parallel lives that occasionally intersected over practical matters. Maria felt invisible, undesired, and desperately lonely. That loneliness made her vulnerable to someone who would see her, who would desire her, who would make her feel alive again, even if that someone was wildly inappropriate and dangerously obsessed. The Cooper family had lived on Cypress Avenue even longer than the Riveras, having moved into their house 28 years earlier, when Thomas Cooper first got his job as a foreman at a manufacturing plant in Vernon. Thomas was a quiet, hard-working man in his early 60s who had spent his entire career at the same company, slowly advancing through the ranks through reliability and dedication rather than ambition or brilliance. His wife, Patricia, was 59, a retired elementary school teacher who spent her days volunteering at the library and tending her elaborate garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. They had raised 3 children in the house on Cypress Avenue, all of whom had moved out and started their own lives, except for their youngest son, Dylan, who had recently returned home. Dylan Cooper was 24 years old, though he often seemed younger in his maturity and decision-making. He had left home at 18 to attend community college with vague plans of eventually transferring to a 4-year university, but he had drifted through various majors without settling on a direction. After 4 years of inconsistent effort, he had dropped out without earning a degree, working a series of minimum wage jobs that never lasted more than a few months before he quit or was let go for attendance or attitude problems. 6 months before Maria's death, Dylan had moved back into his childhood bedroom after losing his most recent apartment due to unpaid rent. Thomas and Patricia had mixed feelings about their son's return. On one hand, they wanted to support their child during a difficult period. On the other hand, they were frustrated by his apparent lack of ambition or direction. Dylan slept until noon most days, played video games for hours, occasionally did odd jobs for neighbors to earn spending money, but showed no serious interest in finding steady employment or getting his life back on track. He was handsome in a boyish way, with dark hair, an easy smile, and the kind of charm that made people want to help him even when they knew they probably should not. He could be engaging and funny when he wanted to be, but he also had a tendency towards self-pity and blaming others for his failures. His parents hoped that living at home would motivate him to get his act together, but instead, Dylan seemed content to drift indefinitely. Patricia Cooper and Maria Rivera had been friendly neighbors for years, though not extremely close friends. They attended the same church, their children had played together when they were younger, and they often chatted when they encountered each other in their front yards or at community events. Patricia admired Maria's dedication to her family and her involvement in the church. Maria appreciated Patricia's warmth and her beautiful garden. When Dylan moved back home, Patricia mentioned it to Maria one Sunday after church services, expressing her frustration with her son's lack of motivation in the way mothers do when they need to vent, but also feel guilty about complaining. Maria listened sympathetically, offering reassurance that Dylan was young and would figure things out eventually, that young people today faced challenges their generation had not had to deal with. Patricia appreciated the kind words, never imagining that this conversation would lead to her son spending time with Maria, developing an obsessive attachment, and ultimately murdering her in a violent rage. Dylan first approached Maria a few weeks after that conversation. She was outside watering her front lawn in the late afternoon, and Dylan was taking a walk around the neighborhood because his mother had told him he needed to get out of the house instead of sitting in front of a screen all day. He stopped to chat, initially just being neighborly, complimenting her flowers and making small talk about the weather. Maria was friendly but not particularly interested, answering his questions politely but not encouraging extended conversation. Dylan sensed her reserve but was drawn to her in a way he did not fully understand. She was beautiful in a way that was different from the girls his age he occasionally dated or met online. Maria had a maturity and grace that made her seem sophisticated and mysterious to him. She was also kind without being condescending, treating him like an adult rather than a disappointing child the way his parents did. Over the next few weeks, Dylan found excuses to talk to Maria whenever he saw her outside. He offered to help her carry groceries from her car. He asked advice about his job search, though he was not actually looking for a job. He mentioned that he was interested in learning about Filipino culture and asked if she could recommend books or movies. Maria found these interactions harmless and even somewhat flattering. Here was a young man who seemed genuinely interested in talking to her, listening to her opinions, valuing her perspective. She did not see any romantic or sexual dimension to their conversations, viewing Dylan as basically a kid despite his age. She thought she was being a good neighbor and a kind adult by being friendly and encouraging. She had no idea that Dylan was developing feelings for her that went far beyond neighborly interest, that he was beginning to fantasize about her, to interpret her kindness as special interest in him specifically. The progression from friendly neighbor conversations to something more crossed a line so gradually that Maria did not recognize the danger until it was too late. The affair between Maria Santos Rivera and Dylan Cooper began not with passion, but with loneliness and attention. It started with conversations that lasted a little longer each time, with Dylan timing his walks to coincide with when Maria was outside, with Maria starting to look forward to seeing him even as she told herself she was just being friendly. Dylan had begun stopping by the Rivera house during the day when he knew Robert would be at work and the children at school, ostensibly to ask Maria's advice about various things or to return borrowed items from his mother. Maria knew she should maintain boundaries, but she was so starved for adult conversation and attention that she allowed these visits to continue. They would sit in her kitchen and talk for an hour or more, discussing everything from movies to philosophy to their frustrations with life. Dylan complained about his parents' expectations and his inability to find direction. Maria opened up about feeling invisible in her own home, about missing the person she used to be before marriage and children consumed her identity. These conversations created an emotional intimacy that Maria had not experienced in years. Dylan listened to her in a way Robert never did, asked follow-up questions, remembered details from previous conversations. He looked at her when she talked, really looked at her, seeing her as an individual woman rather than just someone's wife and mother. For Maria, this attention was intoxicating. She knew Dylan was younger, knew he was her neighbor's son, knew that spending time alone with him was inappropriate, but she rationalized it as harmless friendship. Dylan, meanwhile, was falling in love with an idealized version of Maria that existed more in his imagination than in reality. He saw her as a tragic figure, trapped in a loveless marriage with a husband who did not appreciate her, waiting to be rescued by someone who would truly value her. He did not see a real, complicated woman with responsibilities and a family. He saw a fantasy. The emotional affair became physical on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late March, approximately 8 months before Maria's death. Dylan had come over ostensibly to return a book Maria had lent him, though they both knew it was just an excuse for another conversation. They sat on the couch in the living room instead of at the kitchen table, closer together than usual. Maria was talking about a trip she had taken to San Francisco years ago when she felt Dylan's hand cover hers. She should have moved her hand away immediately. She should have ended the visit and established firm boundaries. Instead, she left her hand where it was, feeling her heart race, feeling desired for the first time in years. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Dylan leaned toward her and kissed her, and Maria made the choice that would ultimately lead to her death. She kissed him back. The physical relationship that followed was conducted with careful planning and paranoid attention to avoiding discovery. Dylan would come over only during narrow windows when Robert was definitely at work and the children were at school. They would keep the curtains closed, the doors locked, Maria's phone nearby in case Robert called unexpectedly. Their physical encounters were rushed and tinged with guilt on Maria's part, though Dylan seemed to interpret her conflicted feelings as passion. Afterward, Maria would immediately clean any trace of Dylan's presence, spraying air freshener, changing sheets if they had gone to the bedroom, checking for stray hairs or items left behind. She lived in constant fear of being discovered, but she could not seem to stop. For a few stolen hours each week, Maria felt alive and desirable and seen. Dylan made her feel young again, made her feel beautiful, made her feel like her life was not simply over, except for fulfilling obligations to others. The guilt was crushing, particularly for a woman raised with strong Catholic values about the sanctity of marriage. Maria confessed her sins to a priest at a church across town where she was not known, receiving absolution but continuing the affair. She told herself it was temporary, that it would end soon, that she would return to being the faithful wife and mother she was supposed to be. She tried to end it multiple times in those first few months, telling Dylan they had to stop, that it was wrong, that they would get caught. But Dylan would plead and promise and declare his love, and Maria's resolve would crumble under the weight of her loneliness and her need to feel valued. She did not love Dylan, not really, but she loved how he made her feel. That distinction would prove deadly. Dylan's feelings, in contrast, were possessive and obsessive from the beginning. He believed he and Maria had a special connection, that they were meant to be together, that she would eventually leave her husband and children to start a new life with him. Maria tried to make clear that this was impossible, that she would never leave her family, that their relationship had no future beyond the present stolen moments. Dylan heard these words but did not believe them. He convinced himself that Maria was just afraid, that once she realized how much he loved her, she would find the courage to leave her marriage. This delusion would grow more intense as months passed, setting the stage for violence when reality finally penetrated his fantasy. For 8 months, the affair continued in a pattern of secret meetings, intense physical encounters, mounting guilt on Maria's part, and increasing possessiveness on Dylan's part. Maria managed her double life with impressive discipline, maintaining the facade of the perfect wife and mother, while conducting a secret relationship right under everyone's noses. The close calls were frequent and terrifying. Once, Robert came home sick from work unexpectedly while Dylan was there. Maria heard the garage door opening and managed to get Dylan out the back door and over the fence into the neighbor's yard, seconds before Robert entered through the front. Another time, Emily forgot something at home, and her teacher drove her back to get it, arriving at the house while Maria and Dylan were in bed. Maria threw on clothes and met Emily at the door, claiming she had been napping, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. These near discoveries should have ended the affair immediately, but instead they added an element of danger that made the relationship feel even more intense. Maria knew she was playing with fire, knew that discovery would destroy her family, but she could not stop. Or more accurately, she did not stop until it was too late, until Dylan's obsession had grown to the point where he could not accept it being over. The affair that Maria Santos Rivera had carefully hidden for 8 months was conducted with the kind of operational security that would have impressed intelligence operatives. She deleted text messages immediately after reading them, cleared her browser history obsessively, kept her phone password protected and always with her. She scheduled Dylan's visits during windows of time when there was zero possibility of Robert or the children coming home unexpectedly. She paid attention to the routines of neighbors, making sure no one would see Dylan entering or leaving her house. She varied the times and days of their meetings to avoid establishing a pattern that someone might notice. She never wore perfume when Dylan was coming over, so Robert would not notice a different scent. She was careful about her behavior around Patricia Cooper, remaining friendly but not overly warm, never giving any indication that she knew Dylan beyond casual neighborly interaction. Maria understood that the biggest threat to maintaining her secret was not deliberate investigation, but accidental discovery. Someone happening to look out a window at the wrong moment. Someone making an unexpected phone call or visit. One small mistake that would unravel everything. The technological aspects of hiding the affair required constant vigilance, Maria had created a separate email account that she accessed only on her phone, never on the family computer. Dylan was saved in her contacts under a woman's name in case Robert happened to see a notification. They primarily communicated through an encrypted messaging app that auto-deleted conversations after 24 hours. Maria had disabled location services on her phone, so Robert could not track her movements. She cleared her car's GPS history regularly in case Robert ever checked it. The level of deception required to maintain the affair was exhausting, but Maria had learned to compartmentalize, to switch between her roles as faithful wife and secret lover with practiced ease. The physical locations for their encounters were limited by necessity. They could not risk being seen together anywhere public in or near their neighborhood. Hotels were out of the question, since using a credit card would leave a record, and using cash would require withdrawing large amounts of money that Robert would notice. Most of their time together was spent in Maria's home during those narrow windows of opportunity, though once they had driven separately to a park in a different part of the city where no one would recognize them, parking in different areas and meeting by a remote trail where they walked and talked before both heading home separately. The risk of that outing had terrified Maria so much that she refused to do it again. Dylan's possessiveness manifested in subtle ways long before it became overtly threatening. He wanted to know everything about Maria's life with Robert, asking detailed questions about their physical relationship that made Maria uncomfortable. He checked her social media constantly, though she had to keep her accounts active and normal to avoid arousing Robert's suspicion. He wanted her to text him multiple times a day, even when they could not meet, becoming moody and withdrawn if she went more than a few hours without contact. He started referring to Robert as him or your husband, with contempt in his voice, making disparaging comments about Robert's long work hours and emotional distance. He fantasized out loud about their future together, making plans for where they would live after Maria left her husband, how they would explain things to people, how her children would adjust. These conversations made Maria increasingly uncomfortable because they revealed how completely Dylan had detached from reality. She tried to gently correct his misconceptions, reminding him that she was never leaving her family, that they had no future together, that what they were doing was temporary and would have to end eventually. Dylan would seem to accept this in the moment, but then resume his fantasy planning, as though the conversation had never happened. The closest they came to being discovered happened in early September, 4 months before Maria's death. Robert had taken the afternoon off work, something he rarely did, to attend a parent-teacher conference at Joshua's school. The conference was rescheduled at the last minute, and Robert decided to come home instead of returning to the office. He had not told Maria about the schedule change. When he pulled into the driveway at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, Dylan was inside with Maria. They heard the garage door opening and both immediately panicked. There was no time for Dylan to leave through the front door without Robert seeing him. Dylan ran to the back of the house while Maria frantically smoothed her hair and clothes. Dylan exited through the back door and quickly scaled the wooden fence into the adjacent neighbor's yard, dropping into their bushes just as Robert entered the house through the kitchen door. Maria was standing at the counter pretending to chop vegetables for dinner, her hands shaking, her face flushed. Robert noticed nothing wrong, complained about the rescheduled conference, grabbed a drink from the refrigerator, and went to his home office to finish some work. Maria continued preparing dinner while her heart slowly stopped racing, knowing how close she had come to losing everything. That night, she could not sleep, replaying the scene in her mind, imagining what would have happened if Robert had been 30 seconds earlier, if he had seen Dylan in the house or leaving through the back. The near miss should have ended the affair immediately. Maria tried to break it off with Dylan the next time she saw him, explaining that they had gotten too comfortable, too careless, that it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. But Dylan did not accept this. He argued that it had all worked out fine, that they just needed to be more careful. that giving up what they had because of fear was wrong. He pleaded with her, told her he loved her, said he could not imagine his life without her. And Maria, weak and conflicted and still craving the attention and desire he provided, eventually agreed to continue. But she insisted on new rules: no more meetings unless she initiated them, no more texting unless absolutely necessary, longer gaps between their encounters to reduce risk. Dylan agreed to these terms but began to chafe under them almost immediately. He wanted more access to Maria, more of her time and attention. The fact that he had to share her with a husband and family he resented made him increasingly angry. His messages became more demanding, his mood during their meetings more volatile. He would swing between passionate declarations of love and sullen complaints about how little time they had together. He started mentioning other women his age he could date if Maria did not have time for him, obvious attempts to make her jealous that only annoyed her. The dynamic between them was shifting in ways that Maria recognized as dangerous, but felt powerless to control. She had created a situation where a young man with limited emotional maturity had become obsessively attached to her, and she did not know how to safely extract herself from it. The emotional entanglement had become toxic, but ending it would require confrontation and conflict that Maria desperately wanted to avoid. So she kept going, kept seeing Dylan when he pressured her, kept maintaining the exhausting double life, kept telling herself it would end soon on its own. But secret affairs do not end on their own. They end with discovery or with someone finally having the courage to end them despite the emotional fallout. Maria would eventually find that courage, but by then, it would be too late. Dylan's obsession had grown beyond the point where he could accept rejection, and Maria's attempt to reclaim her life would cost her everything. The unraveling of the affair between Maria Santos Rivera and Dylan Cooper began in late October, approximately 6 weeks before her death. Maria had spent the previous weeks in deep reflection about her life, her marriage, and her choices. The guilt that she had been suppressing for months had become unbearable, particularly as the holidays approached and she was forced to confront what she was doing to her family. Halloween had always been Emily's favorite holiday, and watching her daughter excitedly plan her costume while knowing she was betraying her family made Maria physically sick. She looked at Robert across the dinner table one evening, seeing not the distant husband she had resented but the father of her children, the man who worked exhausting hours to provide for them, the man who deserved better than a wife who was cheating on him with their neighbor's son. She thought about what would happen if her children ever found out what she had done, how it would damage them, how they would never look at her the same way. She imagined Emily's face, Joshua's disappointment, the shame they would feel knowing their mother had violated the sanctity of their family. The weight of what she had been doing finally broke through all the rationalizations she had constructed. Maria realized that she had been lying to herself about the affair being harmless or temporary. Every time she was with Dylan, she was making an active choice to risk destroying her family. Every time she justified continuing, she was choosing her own gratification over her children's well-being. She had become someone she did not recognize, someone who was capable of profound selfishness and deception. The person she saw when she looked in the mirror disgusted her. She had to end it, completely and permanently, no matter how difficult the conversation would be, or how much Dylan might be hurt. She made this decision alone, not consulting anyone, not seeking support or advice. She would end the affair, confess to a priest, beg God's forgiveness, and spend the rest of her life being the wife and mother she should have been all along. She would never tell Robert about her betrayal because she did not want to burden him with pain to relieve her own guilt. She would carry this secret to her grave, which was only fitting punishment for what she had done. Maria called Dylan on a Monday morning in early November, asking him to come over that afternoon for a conversation. Dylan arrived at 1 o'clock, expecting their usual routine. Instead, he found Maria fully dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee rather than waiting for him in bed or on the couch. The formality of the setting immediately put him on edge. Dylan sat across from her, and Maria spoke the words she had rehearsed a dozen times. She told him that what they had been doing was wrong, that she should never have let it start, that it was over-effective immediately. She said she cared about him and hoped he would find happiness, but that they could never be together again in any capacity beyond casual neighborly interaction if they happened to encounter each other. She said she was going to work on her marriage and her family, that she needed him to respect her decision and leave her alone. She spoke calmly and firmly, making it clear this was not negotiable or open for discussion. Dylan listened in stunned silence, his face going through a progression of emotions from confusion to hurt to anger. He tried to argue, saying she did not mean it, that she was just scared, that they could work through whatever was bothering her. Maria interrupted him, repeating that it was over and nothing he said would change her mind. Dylan's voice rose as he insisted she could not just end things like this, that they had something special, that she had told him she cared about him. Maria remained calm, explaining that what they had was wrong and destructive, that it was based on her loneliness and his fantasy rather than any real foundation for a relationship. She told him she was sorry for leading him on, for letting things go as far as they had, but that it ended now. Dylan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. He said she was lying, that she did not really want to end it, that she was just confused. He accused her of using him, of treating him like he did not matter now that she had gotten what she wanted from him. He said cruel things about her being selfish, about her being a hypocrite who cheated on her husband, then suddenly wanted to be moral. Maria absorbed his anger without responding, understanding that it came from pain but not changing her position. She asked him to leave. Dylan refused, continuing to argue and plead, his emotions cycling rapidly between anger and desperation. Finally, Maria stood up and walked to the front door, opening it in a clear dismissal. Dylan had no choice but to leave, but as he walked past her, he stopped and grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to convey threat. He said this was not over, that she could not just throw him away, that they needed to talk more when she had calmed down. Maria pulled her wrist free and told him firmly to go home and to not contact her again. She closed the door behind him and locked it, then stood with her back against the door for several minutes, shaking from the confrontation. She had known it would be difficult, but Dylan's intensity had frightened her. She hoped he would accept her decision once he had time to process it. But part of her recognized that she might have created a dangerous situation. The weeks following Maria's attempt to end the affair were marked by increasingly aggressive behavior from Dylan Cooper that should have been recognized as dangerous, but was instead minimized or hidden. Dylan did not accept Maria's decision as final. He texted her dozens of times that first day, messages alternating between apologetic and angry. Maria did not respond to any of them, hoping her silence would communicate what words had not. But Dylan interpreted her lack of response as playing hard to get, or as evidence that she was still emotional and would come around. He showed up at her house the next day, ringing the doorbell repeatedly until Maria answered just to make him stop, worried that neighbors would notice the commotion. She spoke to him through the screen door, refusing to let him inside, reiterating that they were done. Dylan cycled through arguments he had clearly been rehearsing, each one more desperate than the last. He said she was making a mistake, that Robert did not appreciate her the way he did, that she was choosing duty over happiness. He promised to be more patient, to accept whatever limited time she could give him, to stop pressuring her about leaving her husband. None of it mattered. Maria told him again to leave her alone and closed the inner door, leaving Dylan standing on the porch. She watched through the window as he eventually walked away. His shoulders slumped, and she felt a mixture of guilt and relief. Over the following days, Dylan's attempts to contact Maria escalated. He texted her at all hours, sent long emails declaring his love, left voice messages that ranged from sweet to accusatory. Maria blocked his number, but he started calling from different numbers, from payphones, from internet calling services. She blocked his email addresses, and he created new ones. He started driving past her house slowly, sometimes parking across the street for hours at a time, just watching. Maria noticed his car but felt paralyzed about what to do. She could not go to the police without explaining why this young man was obsessing over her. She could not tell Robert without confessing the affair. She could not tell Patricia Cooper without betraying that she had been sleeping with Patricia's son. The only person Maria felt she could confide in was her younger sister, Carmen Santos, who lived in San Diego. Carmen was 32, unmarried, working as a nurse, and had always been Maria's closest confidant. The sisters spoke by phone at least once a week, and Carmen had sensed something was wrong with Maria for months, hearing stress in her voice, noting that she seemed distracted and unhappy. On a Saturday in mid-November, Maria finally broke down and told Carmen everything. She admitted the affair, explained how isolated and lonely she had been feeling, described Dylan's obsessive behavior since she had ended things. Carmen listened without judgment, which was what Maria needed most. She did not lecture or say, "I told you so," though she certainly could have. Instead, she focused on the immediate safety concern. Dylan's behavior, as Maria described it, raised serious red flags. The constant attempts to contact her despite being told to stop, the surveillance of her house, the refusal to accept that the relationship was over. These were classic warning signs of someone who could become violent. Carmen strongly advised Maria to document everything, save all the messages, keep a record of when Dylan showed up at the house, write down dates and times of incidents. She urged Maria to consider telling Robert, arguing that Maria's embarrassment was less important than her safety. But Maria adamantly refused. She insisted that telling Robert would destroy her family, that her marriage could not survive that betrayal, that her children would be traumatized. She said she would rather risk dealing with Dylan alone than risk losing her family. Carmen reluctantly agreed not to push the issue, but made Maria promise to call the police if Dylan made any explicit threats or if his behavior escalated further. Maria agreed, though she had no intention of following through unless absolutely necessary. She still believed she could manage the situation, that Dylan would eventually give up and move on once he realized she was serious. This optimism would prove catastrophically misplaced. Dylan's behavior did continue to escalate throughout November. His text messages became angrier and more threatening, though they carefully stopped short of explicit threats of violence. He wrote things like, "You will regret treating me this way, and you cannot just throw people away when you are done with them. And I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." The last message terrified Maria, because it implied he might expose the affair. She imagined him telling Robert, telling her children, telling people at church, destroying her reputation in the community. She sent him one final text, begging him to leave her alone and promising that if he respected her wishes and stayed away, she would never tell anyone about their relationship. Dylan's response was chilling in its simplicity. "You do not get to negotiate. I am not going away." After that, Maria blocked every method of communication she could think of and tried to pretend the situation would resolve itself. Dylan began stalking Maria more intensively. He learned her routines, knowing what time Robert left for work, when the children left for school, when Maria went grocery shopping or to church activities. He was not always obvious about his surveillance, but Maria increasingly felt watched. She would catch glimpses of his car parked a block away when she left the house. She would see him in the background at the grocery store, pretending to shop but clearly following her. Once, she saw him at her children's school during pickup time, standing far enough away to maintain plausible deniability, but clearly there to watch her. That incident particularly frightened Maria, because it showed Dylan was willing to get near her children, to invade that space. She considered confronting him, but feared it would only make things worse. The most frightening incident before the murder occurred 2 weeks before Maria's death. She had gone to evening mass at her church, arriving alone because Robert was working late and the children were at home doing homework. After the service, she walked to her car in the parking lot, which was mostly empty at that hour. Dylan was leaning against her car, waiting for her. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as she approached, looking around for other people but seeing no one. Dylan did not say anything at first, just stared at her with an expression she could not read. When Maria asked him what he was doing there, he said he needed to talk to her, that she had been ignoring him, that they needed to work things out. Maria kept her distance, refusing to get within arm's reach, and said there was nothing to work out. Dylan's voice turned angry as he accused her of being cold, of using him and discarding him, of thinking she was better than him. He said he had given her everything, and she had given him nothing in return. Maria tried to de-escalate, speaking calmly, acknowledging that she understood he was hurt, but insisting that his behavior had to stop. Dylan suddenly slammed his hand on her car hood, the sharp sound making Maria jump. He leaned toward her, his face contorted with rage, and said, "You think you can just walk away? You think you can just end this? You are mine, and this is not over until I say it is over." For the first time, Maria felt genuinely afraid for her physical safety. She ran back toward the church, where she knew there would be people, and Dylan did not follow her. She waited inside the church for 20 minutes, asking one of the priests if he could walk her to her car. Father Miguel did so, asking if everything was okay, and Maria lied, saying she had just been spooked by being alone in a dark parking lot. When she got home that night, she was shaking. She checked all the locks on the doors and windows, something she had never worried about before. She briefly considered telling Robert everything, but the words would not come. How could she explain that she had been having an affair with their neighbor's son, that the situation had spiraled out of control, that she might be in danger? The admission would destroy everything she had been trying to protect. So instead, Maria said nothing. She went to bed that night beside her husband, staring at the ceiling for hours, wondering if Dylan was outside watching the house, wondering how long before his obsession either burned out or exploded into something worse. She would never know the answer because she had only 2 more weeks to live. Tuesday, December 10th, began as an ordinary day in the Rivera household. Maria woke at 6:30 in the morning to the alarm on her phone, the same routine she followed every weekday. She showered quickly, dressed in jeans and a comfortable sweater, and went downstairs to make breakfast for her family. Robert was already in the kitchen, dressed for work in a suit and tie, making coffee and checking emails on his phone. They exchanged minimal conversation, the kind of functional communication that had characterized their marriage for years. Robert mentioned he would be home late because of a meeting with East Coast clients that required him to stay connected during their business hours. Maria acknowledged this information without comment. She was used to Robert's long hours and last-minute schedule changes. She had stopped expecting him to be present for family dinners or evening activities years ago. At 7 o'clock, Maria woke Emily and Joshua, both of whom were reluctant to leave their warm beds on a cold December morning. She returned downstairs to put bread in the toaster and pour orange juice, maintaining the morning routine that provided structure for her children. Joshua came down first, 14 years old and increasingly independent, grabbing his toast and eating it standing up while scrolling through his phone. Emily followed a few minutes later, 11, and still young enough to want her mother's attention in the morning, chattering about a project she was working on for school. Maria listened and responded appropriately while packing lunches for both children, adding a note in Emily's lunchbox that said, "I love you," the way she did most days. Robert left for work at 7:30, kissing Maria briefly on the cheek in an automatic gesture that held no particular affection or warmth. He called goodbye to the children, reminded Maria about his late evening, and left through the garage door. Maria heard his car pull out of the driveway and watched through the window as he drove down the street, past the Cooper house 3 doors down where Dylan likely still slept. At 7:45, Maria walked her children to the corner where the school bus stopped, waving as they boarded and watching the bus drive away. She walked back to the house, noticing the morning was cold and grey, clouds suggesting rain later in the day. She went inside, locked the front door, and began the daily routine of household maintenance that filled her mornings. She loaded the breakfast dishes into the dishwasher, wiped down the counters, started a load of laundry. She worked methodically, her mind on the various tasks she needed to accomplish that day. She planned to vacuum the upstairs bedrooms, clean the bathrooms, go to the grocery store, and prepare ingredients for dinner, even though Robert would not be home to eat it. The routine nature of these tasks was comforting, requiring no thought or emotional energy. At 10 o'clock, Maria took a break to drink coffee and check her phone. She had several messages in the church volunteer group chat about an upcoming fundraising event. She responded to a few, confirming she would bring her usual contribution of lumpia, the Filipino spring rolls that always sold out quickly at church functions. She scrolled through social media briefly, seeing photos posted by friends and acquaintances that showed carefully curated versions of their lives. Everyone looked happy, successful, fulfilled. Maria wondered if anyone else felt as hollow as she did behind their public facade. She put the phone down and continued with her cleaning tasks, trying not to think about the fact that another day stretched ahead of her with nothing meaningful to fill it beyond household chores and childcare. At 10:30, there was a knock at the front door. Maria was upstairs changing sheets on Joshua's bed when she heard it. Her first thought was that it was a delivery, though she was not expecting any packages. Her second thought was that it might be Dylan, and her stomach clenched with anxiety. She had not heard from him in almost a week, which had given her hope that he had finally accepted the relationship was over and moved on. She walked downstairs slowly, looking through the front window to see who was at the door before deciding whether to answer. It was Dylan. He stood on the porch, hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking at the door with an expression Maria could not read from her angle of view. Her first instinct was to not answer, to pretend she was not home, to wait for him to leave, but she could see his car parked in her driveway, meaning he knew someone was home. If she did not answer, he might just keep knocking, or worse, go around to the back of the house to try other doors. Maria made a decision she would not live to regret because she would not live beyond the next hour. She opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged, so the door only opened a few inches. Through the gap, she asked Dylan what he wanted. His voice was calm, almost gentle when he replied. He said he just wanted to talk, that he knew she was angry with him, that he wanted to apologize for his behavior at the church parking lot. He said he had been going through a hard time, that he had not been thinking clearly, but that he was better now. He promised he just wanted 5 minutes to apologize properly, and then he would leave her alone forever. Maria hesitated, weighing her options. Part of her wanted to slam the door, to refuse any engagement, to maintain the boundaries she had been trying to establish. But another part of her felt guilty about how things had ended, felt responsible for Dylan's pain because she had initiated the affair, felt like she owed him the courtesy of hearing his apology. She also thought that if she let him say his piece, maybe he would finally accept closure and stop his surveillance and attempts to contact her. She made a calculation that would prove fatal. if she allowed him inside for a brief conversation, in a controlled setting during daylight hours when neighbors were around and Robert would be calling to check in later, she could give Dylan his closure while maintaining safety. She told herself she would keep the conversation brief and impersonal, that she would not allow any physical contact, that she would stand near the door so she could ask him to leave easily. It never occurred to Maria that she was letting a dangerous person into her home, that Dylan's obsession had progressed far beyond anything that could be resolved with a conversation, that his calm demeanor was a facade covering rage and humiliation that had been building for weeks. She released the security chain and opened the door, stepping back to allow Dylan to enter. He walked past her into the living room, and Maria closed the door behind him, sealing her fate. The forensic reconstruction of what happened in the Rivera home on December 10th between 11 o'clock and noon would be pieced together by homicide detectives from physical evidence, autopsy findings, and limited statements Dylan made before invoking his right to an attorney. The conversation between Maria and Dylan started in the living room, where they both sat on opposite ends of the couch. Dylan's demeanor was calm initially, apologetic even. He said he was sorry for scaring her at the church, for texting obsessively, for making her uncomfortable. He said he understood why she wanted to end things, that he had been immature and selfish. Maria relaxed slightly, relieved that Dylan seemed to be accepting reality. She thanked him for the apology and said she hoped he would be able to move on and find happiness. This was when Dylan's mask began to slip. He said he could not move on, that what they had was too special, that she was the only person who had ever really seen him. Maria reminded him gently that what they had was wrong, that it was over, that they had both needed to move forward with their lives. Dylan's response was to ask if she ever really cared about him, or if he had just been a diversion to relieve her boredom. The question was loaded with anger despite his calm tone. Maria answered honestly, saying that she had cared about him, but that what they had shared was not love, that it was based on her loneliness and his fantasy rather than reality. She said she regretted the affair, that it had been a mistake, that she wished she could undo it. Dylan stood up abruptly, his calm facade cracking. He said if it had been such a mistake, if she regretted it so much, then what had the last 8 months meant? Had he just been nothing to her? Was everything they had shared meaningless? His voice was rising, his hands gesturing wildly. Maria stood as well, moving toward the front door, suggesting that Dylan should leave now that they had talked. But Dylan positioned himself between Maria and the door, blocking her exit. He said they were not finished, that she could not just dismiss him, that he deserved better than to be thrown away. Maria's fear spiked, but she tried to remain calm, speaking in a soothing tone the way she would to one of her children having a tantrum. She said she was not dismissing him, that she appreciated him coming to apologize, but that they really had said everything that needed to be said. She asked him again to leave. Dylan did not move. Instead, he began crying, tears running down his face as he told Maria that he loved her, that he could not imagine his life without her, that she was everything to him. He begged her to give them another chance, to see if they could make it work, to not throw away what they had. Maria felt pity for him in that moment, seeing how young he looked, how lost. But she remained firm, saying no, it was over, and he needed to accept that. The rejection flipped something in Dylan's mind. His tears stopped as suddenly as they had started. His expression went blank, then twisted into rage. He said if she could not be with him, she could not be with anyone. He said he would make sure Robert knew everything, that he would tell everyone in the neighborhood what she was, that he would destroy her reputation and her family. Maria pleaded with him not to do that, saying her children did not deserve to be hurt because of her mistakes. Dylan laughed, a harsh sound with no humor. He said she should have thought about her children before she opened her legs for him. The crude language and contempt in his voice stunned Maria into momentary silence. Dylan continued, his words becoming increasingly vicious. He called her names, accused her of being a whore who used him, said she was no better than a prostitute, except at least prostitutes were honest about what they were. He said he had wasted 8 months on her when he could have been with women his own age, who were not used up and desperate. Each word was designed to hurt, to diminish, to punish Maria for rejecting him. She tried to move around him to get to the door, but Dylan grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises that would be documented by the coroner. Maria told him to let go, her voice sharp with command and fear. Dylan released her arm but did not move away from the door. He said she was not leaving until they settled this, until she understood what she had done to him. Maria made a critical error in judgment. She became angry instead of afraid, her own frustration with weeks of his stalking and harassment boiling over. She told Dylan he was acting like a child, that she had never promised him anything beyond what they had, that he had created a fantasy in his mind that had never been real. She said he needed to grow up and accept that not everything works out the way you want. She said she had tried to be kind, but his behavior had crossed so many lines that she no longer felt bad about ending things. She said if he ever came near her or her family again, she would tell his parents everything and go to the police with evidence of his harassment. The words were meant to establish boundaries, to shock Dylan into backing down. Instead, they were accelerant on a fire that had been building for weeks. Dylan's face flushed red. He stepped toward Maria, backing her into the living room away from the front door. He asked if she was threatening him, if she really thought she had any power in this situation. He said if she went to the police, he would tell them everything, show them the messages she had sent him, expose her as an adulterer who seduced a younger man. He said no one would believe she was a victim. Everyone would see her as the predator. The two of them stood facing each other, both breathing hard, the space between them charged with anger and fear. Maria tried one more time to de-escalate, softening her voice, saying they were both saying things in anger that they did not mean. She suggested Dylan should go home, that they both needed to calm down, that they could talk more later if necessary. But there would be no later. Dylan had moved past the point of rational conversation. He was locked into a mental state where he saw only two possibilities: Maria agreeing to continue their relationship, or Maria suffering consequences for rejecting him. When she turned to walk toward the kitchen, intending to exit through the back door since Dylan still blocked the front, he followed her. The kitchen was where the confrontation became physical violence. Maria was at the counter when Dylan grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. She stumbled back against the counter, her hip hitting the edge hard. Dylan crowded into her personal space, his face inches from hers, his breath hot on her skin. He said she belonged to him, that she did not get to decide when things were over. Maria pushed against his chest, trying to create distance. Dylan grabbed her wrists, pinning them against the counter. For several seconds they struggled, Maria trying to break free, Dylan holding her in place, both of them making incoherent sounds of effort. Then Maria did something that would seal her fate. She brought her knee up hard into Dylan's groin. He doubled over in pain, releasing her wrists. Maria tried to run toward the back door, but she had only made it a few steps when Dylan recovered enough to lunge after her. He caught her by her hair, yanking her backward. Maria screamed, a sound of pain and terror that carried into the empty house, but reached no neighbors through closed windows and well-insulated walls. Dylan wrapped his arm around Maria's neck from behind, not quite a chokehold, but applying enough pressure to restrict her movement. He dragged her backward toward the counter, Maria's hands clawing at his arm, her feet scrambling for purchase on the smooth tile floor. Her hand connected with a drawer handle, and she pulled it open desperately, hoping to find something to defend herself with. but this drawer contained only dish towels and pot holders, nothing useful as a weapon. Dylan slammed the drawer shut on Maria's hand, causing her to cry out again. Then he saw what was on the counter next to the stove. A wooden knife block containing the full set of German steel kitchen knives that Robert had bought Maria for their 10th anniversary. Dylan released Maria's neck and shoved her away from him, toward the refrigerator. She stumbled but did not fall, regaining her balance and starting to run toward the kitchen doorway. But Dylan had already pulled a knife from the block, the large chef's knife with an 8-inch blade that Maria used for chopping vegetables. He covered the distance between them in 3 steps and plunged the knife into Maria's back, just below her right shoulder blade. Maria Santos Rivera's death was neither quick nor merciful. The first stab wound, which entered her back at a downward angle, punctured her right lung and caused immediate respiratory distress. She fell forward onto her hands and knees, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Blood began spreading across the back of her blue sweater, a dark stain that grew rapidly. Dylan stood over her for a moment, the knife in his hand dripping blood onto the clean tile floor that Maria had mopped 2 days earlier. According to forensic analysis, there was a pause of approximately 15 to 20 seconds between the first wound and the second, enough time for Dylan to make a conscious choice to continue. But instead of stopping, instead of calling 911, instead of experiencing any moment of clarity or remorse, Dylan made the decision to finish what he had started. He bent down and grabbed Maria's shoulder, rolling her onto her back. Her face was contorted in pain and shock, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to breathe through her punctured lung. Blood bubbled at her lips. Her eyes met Dylan's, and in those eyes was confusion, fear, pain, and perhaps the final understanding that she was going to die in her own kitchen while her husband was at work and her children were at school. Dylan stabbed her again, this time in the chest, the blade penetrating her sternum and nicking her heart. Then again, and again. The autopsy would document 17 separate stab wounds, distributed across Maria's chest, abdomen, back, and arms. The wounds on her arms were defensive, sustained while Maria tried to protect herself, raising her hands to block the knife that kept coming down again and again. Several of her fingers were cut deeply, one tendon completely severed. The medical examiner would later testify that Maria remained conscious through most of the attack, which likely lasted between 2 and 3 minutes. 3 minutes of unimaginable terror and pain. 3 minutes of desperate struggling while her strength ebbed away with her blood. 3 minutes of her life draining out onto the kitchen floor. The pattern of blood spatter indicated that Maria had attempted to crawl away at one point, making it several feet toward the kitchen door before Dylan pulled her back. There was arterial spray on the cabinets, indicating at least one wound had severed a major blood vessel. Handprints in blood on the floor showed where Maria had tried to push herself up. A bloody handprint at shoulder height on the refrigerator suggested she had briefly gotten to her knees before collapsing again. The final wounds were inflicted while Maria lay motionless on the floor, no longer able to defend herself or attempt escape. Dylan continued stabbing her even after she had stopped moving, an indication of the rage and loss of control that had overtaken him. One of the final stab wounds went through Maria's left hand, as though she had raised it in a final, futile gesture of protection, the blade passing through her palm and entering her chest. When Dylan finally stopped, he was breathing hard, covered in Maria's blood, the knife still in his hand. The kitchen looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood covered the floor in spreading pools, splattered across the white cabinets and stainless steel refrigerator, smeared on the walls where Maria had briefly leaned against them during her desperate attempt to escape. Maria lay on her back, her eyes open but unseeing, her body still except for the small movements of shallow, labored breathing. She was not yet dead but would be within minutes. The cause of death would be officially listed as multiple sharp force injuries with associated blood loss. But the actual mechanism was more complex. Her right lung had collapsed from the first wound. Multiple lacerations to her liver, spleen, and intestines caused massive internal bleeding. The nick to her heart, while not immediately fatal, compromised her already failing cardiovascular system. She drowned in her own blood while simultaneously bleeding out onto her kitchen floor. In her final moments, as consciousness faded, perhaps Maria thought of her children. Perhaps she thought of Robert and the marriage she had betrayed but ultimately wanted to preserve. Perhaps she thought of the affair that had seemed so harmless at first, so small, a secret that would hurt no one if it was never discovered. Perhaps she experienced regret, not just for dying but for the choices that had led to this moment. Or perhaps there was room for nothing but pain and fear, and the desperate primal desire to keep breathing even as her body shut down, system by system. Dylan stood over Maria's body for several minutes after the attack ended. The rage that had driven him to violence had drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving him shaking and disoriented. He looked at the knife in his hand as though unsure how it had gotten there. He looked at Maria's body, at the amount of blood, at what he had done, and some part of his mind must have recognized that his life was effectively over. He had just murdered someone. He would go to prison. His family would be destroyed. His future, already uncertain, was now non-existent beyond concrete walls and locked doors. Some rational part of his brain began asserting itself over the emotional chaos. He needed to clean up. He needed to hide evidence. He needed to get away from this house before someone discovered what had happened. Dylan went to the kitchen sink and tried to wash the blood off his hands and arms, but it was everywhere, soaked into his clothes, under his fingernails, spattered across his face. He abandoned the attempt at the sink and instead went upstairs to the bathroom, where he cleaned himself more thoroughly, stripping off his bloody shirt and washing his torso and arms. He found a t-shirt in Robert's closet, putting it on despite it being slightly too large. He stuffed his own bloody shirt into a plastic shopping bag he found in the bedroom. Dylan then did something that indicated enough presence of mind to suggest premeditation might be argued by prosecutors. He tried to stage the scene to look like a burglary. He went through the house, opening drawers and cabinets, dumping contents onto the floor, creating the appearance of someone searching for valuables. He took Maria's laptop from the kitchen desk and her iPad from the living room. He found her purse and dumped it out, taking her wallet with its cash and credit cards. He found a jewelry box in the master bedroom and emptied it into a pillowcase. Though he had no idea if any of the items had significant value, these actions took approximately 20 minutes, during which Maria died alone on the kitchen floor in the house she had worked so hard to make a home for her family. By the time Dylan left through the back door at approximately 11:45, Maria Santos Rivera had been dead for nearly 10 minutes. Dylan walked through the backyard, climbed over the fence into the neighbor's yard, and walked around the block to where his car was parked on a side street. He had parked there deliberately, not wanting his car to be seen in Maria's driveway by neighbors. This single fact, the premeditated decision about where to park, would be used by prosecutors to argue that Dylan had planned to harm Maria, that this was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment, but a deliberate act. Dylan drove home, 3 houses down from the crime scene, and went inside without encountering his parents. His mother, Patricia, was out running errands. His father, Thomas, was at work. Dylan took a shower, washing away the remaining traces of Maria's blood, watching it spiral down the drain. He put his bloody clothes and the pillowcase containing Maria's stolen items in a black garbage bag, which he hid in the back of his closet. Then he lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling, his mind blank, unable or unwilling to process what he had done. At approximately 12:30, Patricia Cooper arrived home from grocery shopping and called up the stairs to ask Dylan to help bring bags in from the car. Dylan came downstairs in fresh clothes, helped his mother carry groceries, put items away in the pantry, and acted completely normal. Patricia noticed nothing unusual about her son's demeanor. She had no idea that 3 houses down, Maria Rivera lay dead in a pool of blood, murdered by the child Patricia had given birth to, raised, loved, and worried about. The secret would keep for 6 more hours, during which the world continued normally for everyone except Maria, whose world had ended on the kitchen floor while she was alone and terrified and dying far too young. Robert Rivera arrived home from work at 6:15 in the evening, 30 minutes earlier than the late return he had mentioned that morning. His meetings had finished sooner than expected, and he had decided to head home instead of staying at the office. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed that the house was completely dark. This struck him as odd because Maria always turned on lights throughout the house as evening approached, and she should have been home preparing dinner. The children should have been home from school for hours, but perhaps Maria had taken the kids somewhere, to the mall or to dinner, and forgotten to mention it to him. Robert parked in the garage and entered the house through the door that led into the kitchen. The first thing he noticed was that the lights were off despite the darkness. The second thing was a strange smell, metallic and organic, that his brain could not immediately identify. He reached for the light switch by the door and flipped it on. The kitchen lights blazed to life, illuminating a scene that would be seared into Robert's memory forever. Maria was lying on the floor in an enormous pool of blood that had begun to dry and darken around the edges. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Her body was twisted in an unnatural position. There was blood everywhere, more blood than Robert had imagined a human body could contain, covering the floor, splattered on the cabinets, smeared on the walls. For several seconds, Robert's brain refused to process what he was seeing. It was too unreal, too far removed from anything in his experience. This could not be his kitchen. That could not be his wife lying in blood on the floor. But then, reality crashed over him like a wave, and he was screaming Maria's name, rushing to her, dropping to his knees in her blood, putting his hands on her face, begging her to wake up, to respond, to still be alive even though some part of him knew she had been dead for hours. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely pull his phone from his pocket. He dialed 911, his voice breaking as he tried to explain to the dispatcher what he was seeing. There is blood everywhere. My wife. She is not breathing. Please send help. The dispatcher asked if he was sure his wife was deceased, instructed him not to move the body, asked if he knew what had happened. Robert had no answers. He kept saying he did not know. He just got home from work. He found her like this. Please send help. The dispatcher told him police and paramedics were on the way. To stay on the line, to exit the house in case the perpetrator was still present. But Robert could not leave Maria. He sat on the blood-covered floor next to her body, holding her cold hand, crying, talking to her, asking her what happened, begging her to come back. Somewhere in the distant part of his mind that was still capable of rational thought. He wondered where Joshua and Emily were, hoped desperately that they had not been home, that they had not witnessed whatever had happened to their mother. The first police unit arrived within 6 minutes of the 911 call. Officer James Martinez entered through the front door, which was unlocked, his weapon drawn, calling out police identification. He found Robert in the kitchen, covered in his wife's blood, rocking back and forth, still holding her hand. Martinez quickly assessed that Maria was deceased, that Robert was in shock, and that the scene needed to be secured. He called for his partner to enter, reported a homicide, requested detectives and the medical examiner, and gently tried to convince Robert to leave the kitchen so they could preserve the crime scene. Robert did not want to leave Maria, did not want to let go of her hand, could not accept that she was gone. It took the arrival of paramedics, who confirmed what everyone already knew, that Maria was deceased and had been for several hours, to finally get Robert to stand up and move away from her body. Martinez led Robert to the living room, sat him on the couch, and tried to get basic information. How long had he been gone? Who had access to the house? Was anything missing? Robert could not focus on the questions. He kept asking about his children. Where were his children? Officer Martinez radioed dispatch to check on the location of 2 minors. Within minutes, it was confirmed that Joshua and Emily Rivera were both safe at school. Joshua at basketball practice that ran until 7. Emily at an after-school art program that ended at 6:30. Martinez informed Robert that officers were being sent to the schools to pick up both children and ensure they were safe, that they would be taken to the police station where family services could be called. Robert broke down completely at this information. His children would be told their mother was dead by police officers. They would not have him there to hold them, to explain, to try to make sense of the senseless. They would be traumatized beyond measure, their lives irrevocably changed, their sense of safety and normalcy destroyed. And it was all Robert could think about as more officers arrived, as detectives showed up, as crime scene technicians began photographing and documenting the horror in his kitchen. How would he tell his children? How would they survive this? How could any of them survive this? Within an hour of Robert's arrival home, the quiet street of Cypress Avenue was transformed into a crime scene. Police vehicles lined the road, their lights flashing. Yellow crime scene tape blocked off the Rivera property. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, standing in small groups on sidewalks and driveways, speculating about what had happened. The medical examiner's van pulled up, and those neighbors who were still watching saw a body bag being carried out of the house, understanding that someone had died. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Maria Rivera, the friendly housewife who organized church fundraisers and always had a smile, was dead, murdered in her own home during the day while her family was away. The news hit the Filipino-American community like a shockwave. Within hours, Maria's phone was ringing constantly with calls Robert could not answer. Texts expressing concern and disbelief were piling up unread, and messages were flooding the church group chats asking if the rumors were true, if Maria was really gone. At the Cooper house 3 doors down, Patricia Cooper heard the sirens and saw the police lights. She walked down the street to see what was happening and felt her blood run cold when she realized the police activity was centered at the Rivera home. She asked a neighbor what had happened and was told that Maria was dead, that Robert had found her body, that it appeared to be a homicide. Patricia immediately thought of her friend, the woman she had known for over a decade, the woman who had always been so kind and supportive. She returned home to tell her husband Thomas, who was equally shocked. And Dylan, upstairs in his room pretending to play video games while his heart hammered in his chest, heard his parents talking about the terrible thing that had happened just down the street. He heard his mother crying, saying she could not believe Maria was gone. He heard his father calling to him, telling him to come downstairs, that something terrible had happened to their neighbor. Dylan went downstairs, forced his face into an expression of shock, and listened as his parents told him that Mrs. Rivera had been killed. He said all the right things about how awful it was, how sorry he felt for the family, how scary it was that something like this could happen in their neighborhood. His parents, not knowing the truth, did not notice anything amiss in their son's reaction. They were too caught up in their own grief and shock to see the guilty knowledge behind Dylan's eyes. By midnight, the news of Maria Rivera's murder was being reported by local television stations. A homicide in a quiet suburban neighborhood during the daytime was unusual enough to be newsworthy. Reporters gathered behind the police tape, capturing footage of the house, the crime scene activity, Robert being led out by detectives to be taken to the station for formal questioning, as was standard procedure. The story was framed as every homeowner's nightmare, a break-in gone wrong, a random act of violence that shattered the suburban illusion of safety. No one yet suspected that the truth was much darker, that this was not a random burglary, but a murder born from an affair, obsession, and rejected love. That truth would emerge over the next 48 hours as detectives did their job and the evidence began to tell its story. Detective Sarah Chen of the Los Angeles Police Department Robbery Homicide Division arrived at the Rivera home at 7:30, 90 minutes after the 911 call. Chen was a 16-year veteran of the LAPD, having worked her way up from patrol to robbery to homicide. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to remain emotionally detached from even the most horrific crime scenes. But when she walked into the Rivera kitchen and saw the amount of blood, saw the position of the body, saw the evidence of desperate struggle, even she felt a twist of horror in her gut. This had been brutal. This had been personal. This had been rage. Chen stood in the kitchen doorway for several minutes, just observing, taking in every detail before crime scene technicians began their work of collecting evidence. She noted the knife still on the floor near the body, the wooden block on the counter missing one knife from the set. She noted the defensive wounds on the victim's hands and arms. She noted the number and location of stab wounds, suggesting the attacker had continued long after the victim was incapacitated. She noted the blood spatter patterns that indicated the victim had tried to escape, had crawled across the floor, had fought for her life. She also noted things that did not fit the narrative of a burglary. The victim was fully clothed in casual at-home wear, jeans and a sweater. There were no signs of sexual assault based on the victim's position and clothing. The attack seemed focused on killing rather than any other motive. And most tellingly, the staging throughout the house looked exactly like what it was. Staged. Drawers pulled open and contents dumped out, but in ways that suggested someone was trying to create the appearance of searching rather than actually searching. Valuable items left behind while less valuable items were taken. The laptop and iPad taken from obvious locations, but an expensive camera left on a shelf in plain sight. To Chen's experienced eye, the scene screamed of someone trying to cover up a murder by making it look like a burglary. While crime scene technicians worked, Chen interviewed Robert Rivera at the police station. Robert was in shock, answering questions mechanically, struggling to focus. He provided his timeline for the day, confirming he had left for work at 7:30 that morning and returned home at 6:15 that evening. He had last seen Maria alive that morning over breakfast. He knew of no enemies, no one who would want to hurt his wife. Nothing unusual that had been happening. Chen asked about the state of the Rivera marriage. Were there problems? Had there been talk of separation or divorce? Robert seemed confused by the questions, saying their marriage was fine. They had no major problems beyond the usual stresses of work and parenting. Chen asked if Robert knew of any extramarital affairs, either on his part or Maria's. Robert became angry, defensive, saying his wife was faithful, that she would never cheat, that she was devoted to their family. Chen made note of his reaction, but did not push further at this time. Chen asked about Maria's typical routine on weekdays. Robert explained that she was usually home alone during the day, once the children left for school, that she managed the household, ran errands, volunteered at church, did things with other mothers sometimes. He did not monitor her schedule closely because he trusted her to manage her time. When asked if Maria had mentioned anyone bothering her or following her, Robert said no. When asked if she had seemed worried or scared recently, Robert paused. He said Maria had seemed distracted and stressed for the past few months, but he had attributed it to the holiday season approaching and the busy schedule with children's activities. He admitted he had not asked her about it directly, had not had long conversations with her about anything personal in quite a while. He started to cry again, saying he should have paid more attention, should have been home more, should have noticed if something was wrong. Chen gave him a moment to compose himself, then moved to the question of who had access to the house. Robert said he and Maria had keys. Both children had keys. Maria's sister Carmen had a spare key, and there was one hidden under a rock in the back garden for emergencies. He did not know of anyone else who had keys or regular access. The house had been locked when he left that morning. Security system was not engaged because Maria did not like dealing with it during the day when she was going in and out. There were no security cameras, something Robert was now deeply regretting. While Chen interviewed Robert, her partner, Detective Michael Torres, began interviewing neighbors on Cypress Avenue. The canvass of the neighborhood would prove crucial to identifying the killer. Several neighbors reported seeing Dylan Cooper's car parked on a side street off Cypress Avenue around mid-morning, which struck some as unusual since Dylan usually parked in his family's driveway or directly in front of their house. One neighbor, Mrs. Kim, who lived across the street from the Riveras, reported seeing a young man matching Dylan's description walking in the alley behind the Rivera house around 11 in the morning, but she had not thought anything of it at the time. Another neighbor said they thought they heard someone yelling or screaming around midday, but had dismissed it as kids playing. By midnight on the night of the murder, Detective Chen had a preliminary profile of the crime. This was not a stranger killing or a random burglary. This was personal. The killer likely knew the victim. The level of violence suggested rage and emotional involvement. The staging of a burglary was unsophisticated and suggested the killer was not experienced in covering up crimes. Chen ordered a full forensic workup of the scene, processing for fingerprints, DNA, trace evidence. She ordered Maria's phone records subpoenaed. She ordered security footage pulled from any cameras in the neighborhood that might have captured vehicles or people entering and leaving. She requested Maria's computer and iPad be analyzed for any emails or messages that might indicate problems or conflicts in her life. And she instructed officers to begin compiling a list of everyone who knew Maria, particularly any men who might have had relationships with her. The autopsy was scheduled for the following morning. Dr. Michael Wong, the medical examiner, performed the examination at 8 a.m. His findings confirmed what Chen had suspected from viewing the scene. Maria Santos Rivera had been stabbed 17 times with a kitchen knife. The wounds were distributed across her torso, back, and extremities. 8 of the wounds were potentially fatal, affecting major organs or blood vessels. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had been conscious and fighting for survival during at least the first several blows. Based on the angles and depths of wounds, Dr. Wong estimated that the attacker had been right-handed, of average or above-average strength, and had struck from multiple positions, suggesting the victim had been moving and attempting to escape. Time of death was estimated between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and stomach contents, showing she had eaten breakfast but not lunch. Dr. Wong noted no evidence of sexual assault. Toxicology would take several weeks, but preliminary blood draw showed no drugs or alcohol in her system. Under her fingernails, Maria had skin cells and blood from scratching her attacker, crucial evidence that would be sent for DNA analysis. The breakthrough in the case came later that afternoon, when Detective Chen received the results from the forensic analysis of Maria's cell phone. Her phone had been password protected, but technicians were able to access it using specialized software. What they found was thousands of text messages with someone saved in her contacts as Rachel, but the message content made clear that Rachel was actually a man, and the messages were intimate, sexual, and extended back 8 months. The messages showed the progression of an affair from initial flirtation to regular physical encounters to Maria attempting to end things to increasingly aggressive responses from the other party. While Maria had deleted many of her own messages, enough remained in the message thread to paint a clear picture. She had been having an affair. She had tried to end it. The other person had not accepted this. Recent messages showed Rachel begging Maria to give him another chance, threatening to expose their relationship, accusing her of using him. The most recent message was from 2 days before Maria's death, from Rachel saying, "You will regret treating me this way. I'm not going away." Detective Chen immediately worked to identify who Rachel actually was. The phone number was traced to a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash, a dead end in terms of quick identification. But the content of the messages included enough details that Chen was able to piece together who it was. References to "just down the street," and "your mom talks to her at church," and "I can see your house from my window," indicated someone who lived in very close proximity to Maria. A message where Rachel complained about "my dad constantly asking what I'm doing with my life," suggested a younger man. And a message where Maria wrote, "You need to stop parking where people can see your car," followed by a reference to an older model Honda Civic, gave Chen what she needed. She pulled the neighborhood canvas reports and found that an older Honda Civic was registered to Dylan Cooper at the address 3 houses down from the Riveras. Dylan was 24, lived with his parents, was unemployed, and fit the profile of someone who could have become obsessed with an older woman who showed him attention. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on December 11th, 24 hours after Maria's body was discovered, Detective Chen arrived at the Cooper residence with a warrant to search Dylan's room and seize any electronic devices. Patricia and Thomas Cooper were stunned when police arrived. They insisted there must be some mistake. Dylan barely knew Maria Rivera beyond her being a neighbor, but Chen explained they had evidence suggesting Dylan and Maria had been in communication, that they needed to speak with him about Maria's death. Dylan was upstairs in his room when officers arrived. He was asked to come down, and when he saw police in his living room, his face went pale. Chen read him his Miranda rights and asked if he would be willing to come to the station to answer some questions. Dylan looked at his parents, saw confusion and growing fear in their faces, and made the calculation that refusing would only make him look more suspicious. He agreed to go. At the police station, Dylan was placed in an interview room. Chen and Torres entered after letting him sit for 30 minutes, a standard technique to increase anxiety. Chen started with soft questions, establishing the basics. How did he know Maria? Just as a neighbor. How often did he interact with her? Rarely. Just casual conversation if they saw each other outside. When was the last time he saw her? Maybe a week ago, he could not remember exactly. The detectives let him tell his version, which was essentially that he barely knew Maria. Then Chen opened a folder and began placing printed screenshots of text messages on the table between them. Intimate messages, sexual messages, messages that could only have been written by someone in a relationship with Maria. Dylan's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, fear, anger, resignation. He denied the messages were from him, saying his phone must have been stolen or hacked. Chen pointed out that the phone number was a burner phone, suggesting premeditation about hiding communication. She pointed out specific details in the messages that only Dylan could have known. His birthday mentioned in one message, references to his parents, a message where he complained about a specific video game he was playing. Dylan stopped denying. He sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, and invoked his right to an attorney. Chen expected this. She said okay, they would stop questioning, but she told him they had a search warrant for his room and his car. She told him they had DNA evidence from under Maria's fingernails. She told him that forensic evidence did not lie. She told him the truth would come out whether he talked or not. Dylan said nothing, just stared at the table, but Chen saw what she needed to see, guilt written clearly across his face. The search of Dylan's room produced significant evidence. The black garbage bag in the back of his closet containing his bloody clothes and the pillowcase with Maria's stolen items. Bloodstains on shoes he had worn and not cleaned thoroughly. And most damning, Dylan's personal cell phone which he had left behind, thinking the burner phone was the only one that mattered. That phone contained photos he had taken of Maria, some when she was asleep, some apparently without her knowledge from a distance. It contained his internet search history, showing searches for how to clean up blood, do police check phone records, and crime of passion sentencing, all conducted the evening after Maria's murder. At 7 p.m. on December 11th, Dylan Cooper was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Maria Santos Rivera. The charge was elevated to first-degree murder based on the evidence of premeditation, his attempt to stage the scene, his planning with regard to parking location, and acquiring a burner phone. He was denied bail given the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence. Thomas and Patricia Cooper were destroyed by the news that their son had murdered their neighbor. Patricia collapsed when she learned not only that Dylan had killed Maria, but that he had been having an affair with her, the woman she had been friends with, the woman who lived just down the street. The betrayal was incomprehensible to her. For Robert Rivera, learning that his wife had been having an affair was devastating in a completely different way. He was already processing the violent loss of Maria. Now he had to process that she had been unfaithful, that she had been lying to him for 8 months, that her relationship with their neighbor's son had led to her death. The grief was compounded by anger, betrayal, confusion. And yet, underneath all of those emotions was a deep sadness that his marriage had apparently been so broken that Maria sought connection elsewhere. The question that would haunt him forever was whether he could have prevented this if he had been more present, more attentive, more of a husband instead of just a provider. The impact of Maria Santos Rivera's murder rippled through multiple families and communities with devastating effect. For Robert Rivera and his children, the aftermath was a nightmare of grief, trauma, and impossible logistics. Robert had to tell Joshua and Emily that their mother was dead, murdered in their home while they were at school. Both children struggled to process the information. 14-year-old Joshua initially went numb, retreating into silence, barely speaking for days. 11-year-old Emily became hysterical, refusing to believe it, asking over and over when her mother would come home. Robert, drowning in his own grief, had to be strong for them while feeling like he was barely surviving himself. The family could not return to their home on Cypress Avenue. The kitchen where Maria died had been cleaned by a professional crime scene cleaning service, but none of them could bear the thought of being in that house. Robert's sister took them in temporarily, and the house went on the market within weeks. They would never live there again. The financial strain of maintaining 2 households, plus legal fees for the victim impact statements Robert wanted to make during Dylan's trial, plus therapy for both children, crushed Robert. He had to take a leave of absence from work to focus on his family, which impacted their income at the worst possible time. But money was the least of their concerns. The psychological trauma was profound. Emily developed severe anxiety and could not sleep alone, convinced that someone would hurt her if she was not with her father. Joshua became angry, withdrawn, failing classes at school, getting into fights with other students. Both children needed intensive therapy and would need it for years. The question of whether to tell Joshua and Emily about the affair was agonizing for Robert. His first instinct was to protect them, to let them remember their mother without the complication of knowing she had been unfaithful. But the details of the case would be public record once the trial started. They would eventually find out from news reports or from other kids at school if Robert did not tell them first. On the advice of the family therapist, Robert sat down with his children 6 weeks after Maria's death and told them a simplified version of the truth. Their mother had been lonely. A neighbor had become obsessed with her. When she tried to end the friendship, he hurt her. It was not her fault that he was violent, and Robert wanted them to know that even though their mother had made mistakes, she loved them more than anything. Joshua, at 14, understood more than Robert gave him credit for. He asked directly if his mother had been having an affair, if that was why she was murdered. Robert could not lie to a direct question. He said yes, their mother had been having an affair, but that did not make what happened her fault. People make mistakes in relationships. That does not mean they deserve to be killed. Joshua struggled with this information, feeling betrayed by his mother's choices, angry at her for bringing danger into their home, yet also missing her desperately. The complicated emotions would take years of therapy to process. Emily, at 11, did not fully grasp the implications of affair, and Robert did not elaborate. She knew her mother had a friend who turned out to be dangerous. That was enough for now. The rest could wait until she was older and could understand better. The trauma of losing their mother violently would shape both children for the rest of their lives. Research shows that children who lose a parent to homicide have elevated rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and relationship difficulties. Joshua and Emily would carry this with them always, a wound that could heal but would never fully disappear. For Thomas and Patricia Cooper, the revelation that their son had murdered Maria Rivera destroyed their lives in different but equally profound ways. Patricia in particular was devastated. Maria had been her friend, not her closest friend, but someone she had known for over a decade, someone she had trusted, someone she had genuinely cared about. Learning that Dylan had been sleeping with Maria was a betrayal that cut deep. Learning that Dylan had then murdered Maria was incomprehensible. Patricia collapsed emotionally and physically, requiring hospitalization for severe stress and anxiety. She could not process that the baby she had given birth to, the child she had raised and loved, was capable of such violence. She retreated into depression, refusing to leave her bed for weeks, unable to function. Thomas took over managing the practical aspects of their imploded life while dealing with his own grief and shame. Their two older children, Dylan's siblings who had moved out years earlier, were equally shocked. They had known Dylan was immature and directionless, but they had never imagined him capable of violence. The family fractured under the weight of the scandal and tragedy. Dylan's siblings wanted nothing to do with him, refusing to visit him in jail or provide any support. Thomas was conflicted, feeling obligated to stand by his son as a father, but horrified by what Dylan had done. Patricia could not face Dylan at all. She did not visit him in jail. She did not attend any of his court hearings. In her mind, the son she had known was gone, replaced by a monster she did not recognize. The Cooper family also became pariahs in their neighborhood and in the larger Filipino-American community they had been part of for decades. Neighbors who had been friendly for years now avoided eye contact. Patricia's friends from church stopped calling, not knowing what to say or how to support someone whose son had committed such a crime. The Coopers were associated with Maria's death in a way that made others uncomfortable being around them. They faced ostracism, judgment, and blame. Some people in the community felt the Coopers must have failed as parents to raise a son who could murder someone. Others felt the Coopers were victims too, but simply could not separate the family from the crime. Within 6 months of Maria's death, Thomas and Patricia sold their house on Cypress Avenue at a loss, unable to bear living down the street from where their son had committed murder. They moved to a different part of Los Angeles, where no one knew their name or their history, trying to start over at an age when starting over should not be necessary. Their marriage, strained beyond capacity by grief and guilt, and the impossible question of how they had raised a murderer, would not survive. They separated 2 years after the murder and eventually divorced, both of them living alone. both of them carrying shame they would never fully shed. For Maria's extended family in the Philippines and the United States, the loss was profound. Maria's mother, who had encouraged her to marry Robert and move to America for a better life, was devastated. She had lost her eldest child in the most violent way possible. Maria's 3 younger siblings, including Carmen, who had been the one person Maria confided in about Dylan's stalking, struggled with guilt. Carmen particularly felt she should have done more, should have insisted Maria go to the police, should have flown to Los Angeles to intervene in person. The should have and what if questions would haunt her for years. The Filipino-American community in northeast Los Angeles was shocked by the murder. Maria had been well known and well liked, active in the church, involved in community events, always willing to volunteer or help others. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, filling the church to capacity and overflowing into the parking lot. The service was conducted in both English and Tagalog, reflecting Maria's dual cultural identity. People spoke about her kindness, her dedication to her family, her faith, her warmth. No one mentioned the affair during the funeral, though everyone knew about it by then thanks to news coverage. The community chose to remember Maria for who she was in life, rather than the circumstances of her death. But privately, the affair was discussed at length, particularly among the older generation who held more traditional views. Some judgment was passed. Questions were raised about how a married woman could have an affair, what that said about her values, whether she bore some responsibility for what happened. But most people, even those with traditional values, recognized that having an affair, while a moral failing, was not cause for murder. That Dylan had made the choice to kill Maria was on him, not on her, regardless of what had transpired between them. The broader community conversations about the murder touched on themes of mental health, obsession, domestic violence, and the dangers of secret relationships. Women's groups and domestic violence advocates used Maria's case to educate others about warning signs of obsessive behavior and the importance of reporting stalking and harassment. Maria's death became a cautionary tale, used in workshops and presentations to help people recognize when a relationship has become dangerous and how to seek help. The case also raised uncomfortable conversations about affairs, emotional infidelity, and the breakdown of marriages. While no one blamed Maria for her death, there were conversations about how people end up in affairs, what drives the infidelity, what responsibilities spouses have to each other to maintain emotional intimacy. Some marriages in the community were strengthened by these conversations, couples recognizing issues in their own relationships that needed addressing before distance and loneliness led to worse outcomes. Other marriages were damaged by suspicion and accusations triggered by the case. For the neighborhood of Cypress Park more broadly, the murder shattered the sense of safety that residents had taken for granted. This was not a random crime by a stranger. This was a neighbor killing another neighbor. It was someone they all knew, someone who had seemed normal and harmless. If Dylan could commit murder, who else in the neighborhood might be capable of violence? People who had never locked their doors started installing security systems. Parents who had let their children play freely in the neighborhood started restricting their movements and implementing check-ins. The sense of community trust was damaged in ways that would take years to repair. The criminal case against Dylan Cooper moved through the legal system with the kind of momentum that strong evidence cases typically have. The district attorney's office assigned Senior Deputy DA Marcus Chen to prosecute, knowing the case would attract significant media attention given the salacious details of the affair and the brutal nature of the murder. Chen was a veteran prosecutor who had handled hundreds of murder cases in his 20-year career. He knew the physical evidence against Dylan was overwhelming, but he also knew that defense attorneys would try to create sympathy for Dylan. by painting Maria as the predator who seduced a vulnerable younger man. The prosecution's strategy was multifaceted. First, establish the timeline of events and the physical evidence proving beyond doubt that Dylan had killed Maria. Second, present the text messages and digital evidence showing Dylan's obsessive behavior and refusal to accept the end of the relationship. Third, use expert witnesses to explain the patterns typical of obsessive relationships and violence stemming from rejected attachment. And fourth, humanize Maria to counteract any defense attempts to blame the victim. The forensic evidence against Dylan was damning. His DNA was found under Maria's fingernails where she had scratched him during the attack. His fingerprints were found on the knife used to kill her. His blood, from wounds Maria inflicted while fighting for her life, was found mixed with her blood at the scene. His clothes, recovered from his closet, were covered in Maria's blood in spatter patterns consistent with being worn during a stabbing. The stolen items from Maria's home were found in his possession. His internet search history showed consciousness of guilt. His cell phone showed he had been surveilling Maria, taking photos without her knowledge, tracking her movements. The prosecution had video evidence from a security camera 2 blocks from Cypress Avenue, showing Dylan's car driving toward the area at 10:45 a.m. on the morning of the murder and driving away at 12:10 p.m. Witness statements placed him in the vicinity of Maria's house. The burner phone used to send threatening messages to Maria was purchased at a store near Dylan's house, and security footage showed someone matching Dylan's description making the purchase. The case was, from a prosecutorial standpoint, as close to a slam dunk as murder cases got. But murder trials are not just about evidence. They are about narrative, about making 12 jurors understand not just what happened, but why it matters. The defense team, led by public defender Karen Yamamoto, since Dylan's family could not afford a private attorney, faced an uphill battle. The physical evidence was incontrovertible. Dylan had killed Maria. There was no arguing that fact. So the defense strategy shifted to arguing for a lesser charge, second-degree murder, or even voluntary manslaughter, by claiming the killing was not premeditated but rather a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment when Maria rejected Dylan. The defense would argue that Dylan was a young, vulnerable man who had been seduced by an older married woman, that Maria had used him for 8 months to satisfy her own emotional and physical needs, then discarded him callously when she decided to prioritize her marriage, that Dylan's mental health had deteriorated during the relationship and aftermath, that he was not thinking clearly, that he acted impulsively rather than with premeditation. The defense would not argue that the killing was justified, but that Dylan's culpability was diminished by his emotional state and Maria's own culpability in creating the situation. The trial began 14 months after Maria's death in February. Jury selection took 3 days, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for biases about affairs, domestic violence, age gap relationships, and self-defense claims. The final jury was composed of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from late 20s to early 70s, representing a cross-section of Los Angeles demographics. Opening statements set the tone for the competing narratives. Prosecutor Marcus Chen spent 40 minutes laying out a methodical case. He described Maria as a lonely housewife who made a mistake by getting involved with her neighbor's son. He acknowledged the affair up front, not hiding from it but framing it as a lapse in judgment rather than a defining characteristic. He then described how Dylan became obsessed, how he refused to accept the end of the relationship, how he stalked and harassed Maria for weeks. He described the premeditation shown by Dylan parking his car away from Maria's house, by his use of a burner phone, by his attempt to stage a burglary after the murder. And he described the brutality of the attack: 17 stab wounds, many inflicted while Maria was already incapacitated, showing rage and intent to kill. Chen told the jury that this was not a crime of passion, but a deliberate execution of a woman who dared to reject Dylan Cooper. Defense attorney Karen Yamamoto took a different approach. She spent her opening statement humanizing Dylan, describing his struggles with direction and purpose, his parents' disappointment in him, his loneliness and isolation. She described how Maria, a married woman 15 years his senior, initiated a sexual relationship with him while he was vulnerable. She framed Maria as the predator, though she did not use that word directly, and Dylan as a naive young man who fell in love with someone who was using him. She described Maria's cruel rejection of Dylan after 8 months of intimacy, her refusal to even talk to him, her threats to expose him and ruin his relationships with his parents. Yamamoto argued that Dylan went to Maria's house that day to beg her for closure, that an argument ensued, that things escalated beyond his control, that he acted in a moment of extreme emotional distress without the ability to form intent. She asked the jury to consider the difference between a cold, calculated murder and a tragic situation that spiraled into violence neither party expected. The prosecution presented its case over 8 days. Detective Sarah Chen testified about the investigation, the discovery of the affair through Maria's phone, the identification of Dylan as a suspect, the evidence found in his room. Crime scene technicians testified about the blood spatter analysis, fingerprint evidence, DNA evidence. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death and the nature of the wounds. Forensic experts testified about the timeline based on various pieces of evidence. Each witness added another layer to the overwhelming case against Dylan. The text messages between Maria and Dylan were presented to the jury, projected on screens in the courtroom. The jury read intimate messages between the two, watched the progression of the relationship, saw Maria's attempts to end things, saw Dylan's increasingly desperate and threatening responses. The final message from Dylan to Maria, sent 2 days before the murder, stating, "You will regret treating me this way," hung in the air as powerful evidence of premeditation and motive. Robert Rivera testified, a crucial but painful moment in the trial. Prosecutor Chen walked him through his discovery of Maria's body, his call to 911, his devastation at losing his wife. Then Chen asked the difficult question, did Robert know about the affair? Robert testified that he had not known, that Maria had hidden it completely, that he had been blindsided by the revelation after her death. Defense attorney Yamamoto cross-examined Robert about the state of his marriage, trying to establish that Maria was deeply unhappy and that Robert's inattention drove her to seek connection elsewhere. But Robert handled the questions with dignity, acknowledging that their marriage had problems, but stating clearly that those problems did not justify Maria's murder. His testimony was effective in humanizing Maria for the jury, showing her as a real person with a family who loved her, not just a name in a case file. Carmen Santos, Maria's sister, testified about the conversation she had with Maria, where Maria confessed the affair and expressed fear of Dylan's stalking behavior. Carmen testified that Maria had wanted to end the relationship, but was afraid of Dylan's reaction. She testified that Maria had considered going to the police, but was too ashamed about the affair becoming public. Her testimony was crucial in establishing Maria's state of mind, showing that she was a victim trying to escape a dangerous situation rather than a willing participant in an ongoing relationship. The prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Lisa Martinez, a psychologist specializing in obsessive relationships and violence, testified about the patterns typically seen when relationships end with one party refusing to accept the breakup. She explained the concept of intimate partner violence, noting that while Dylan and Maria were not married or living together, their relationship followed similar patterns to domestic violence cases. She testified about the escalation of behavior, from excessive contact to surveillance to threats to violence, and how Dylan's actions fit this pattern precisely. She explained that the level of violence seen in the attack, 17 stab wounds, indicated rage but also intent, that someone continuing to stab an incapacitated victim is making repeated choices to continue killing. The defense presented its case over 3 days, a much shorter presentation that reflected the difficulty of arguing against overwhelming evidence. The defense called Dylan's parents to testify about his character, his struggles with finding direction, his good qualities as a son and brother. Patricia Cooper, appearing fragile and barely holding together, testified that Dylan had always been sensitive and emotional, that he had struggled with rejection and criticism, that she could not believe he was capable of violence. Her testimony was intended to humanize Dylan and show his vulnerability. Thomas Cooper testified about finding his son withdrawn and depressed in the weeks after Maria ended the affair, noticing that something was wrong, but not knowing what. The defense called its own expert witness, Dr. James Wong, a forensic psychologist, who testified that Dylan showed signs of depression and anxiety in evaluations conducted after his arrest. Dr. Wong testified that Dylan's mental state at the time of the murder was compromised, that he was not thinking clearly, that his judgment was impaired by emotional distress. But on cross-examination, Prosecutor Chen got Dr. Wong to admit that depression and anxiety do not prevent someone from forming intent to kill, that Dylan's actions after the murder, staging the burglary, cleaning up, hiding evidence, showed clear rational thinking and consciousness of guilt. The biggest question was whether Dylan would testify in his own defense. His attorneys debated this extensively. Dylan's testimony could potentially humanize him for the jury, show his remorse, explain his version of events, but it would also subject him to cross-examination by an experienced prosecutor who would eviscerate him. In the end, Dylan chose to testify against the advice of his attorneys. He took the stand on the 8th day of the defense case. Under direct examination by Yamamoto, Dylan presented a version of events that portrayed him as a victim of circumstances. He testified that Maria had initiated the relationship, that he had fallen in love with her, that she had told him she was unhappy in her marriage and was considering leaving her husband. He testified that when Maria ended things, he was devastated, that his whole world fell apart. He testified that he went to her house that day to beg her for closure, to understand why she was throwing away what they had. He testified that Maria was cold and dismissive, that she told him he had meant nothing to her, that he was just a distraction. He testified that something in him broke when she said that he could not remember clearly what happened next, that the next thing he knew, Maria was on the floor bleeding and he panicked. He testified that he never meant to kill her, that it happened so fast, that he was not thinking clearly. Dylan's testimony was emotional, and he cried multiple times on the stand. But his account had significant problems. It contradicted the physical evidence showing Maria had fought desperately to escape, suggesting she had not been standing still, having a calm conversation when the attack began. It contradicted the text messages showing Maria had been trying to end things gently for weeks, not cruelly or suddenly, and his claim that he could not remember the attack clearly contradicted his detailed memory of events before and after, suggesting convenient selective amnesia. Prosecutor Marcus Chen's cross-examination of Dylan was brutal. Chen walked Dylan through every text message, every instance of harassment, every time Maria asked him to leave her alone. Chen confronted Dylan with his internet searches after the murder, showing consciousness of guilt. Chen forced Dylan to describe the attack in detail, making him acknowledge each of the 17 stab wounds, asking him at what point during those 17 strikes did he decide to stop trying to kill Maria. Dylan had no good answer. Chen asked Dylan why. If this was an uncontrolled emotional reaction, did he have the presence of mind to stage a burglary? Why did he take Maria's laptop and iPad? Why did he hide his bloody clothes instead of calling 911? Why did he act completely normal with his parents for 6 hours after killing someone? Dylan's answers were weak and unconvincing. By the time Chen finished his cross-examination, Dylan's credibility was destroyed. The jury could see him not as a heartbroken young man who lost control in a moment of passion, but as a calculating killer who tried to cover his tracks and was now lying to avoid accountability. In closing arguments, both sides made their final appeals to the jury. Defense attorney Yamamoto urged the jury to see the complexity of the situation, to recognize Dylan's humanity, to understand that this was a tragedy where both parties made mistakes. She argued for a conviction on voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging Dylan's guilt but arguing for mercy based on his emotional state and diminished capacity. Prosecutor Chen's closing was powerful. He reminded the jury of the evidence, of the 17 stab wounds, of the staging and cover-up, of Dylan's lies on the witness stand. He reminded them of Maria's fear in her final weeks, her sister's testimony about Maria's attempts to escape the situation. He reminded them of Emily and Joshua Rivera, who would grow up without a mother because Dylan Cooper could not accept rejection. He argued that this was not voluntary manslaughter or a crime of passion, but first-degree murder, planned and executed by a man who believed he owned Maria Santos Rivera, and that if he could not have her, no one could. Chen ended his closing with a quote from one of Dylan's text messages to Maria: "You are mine, and this is not over until I say it is over." He told the jury that Dylan had meant those words literally, and that Maria had paid for his obsession with her life. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days before reaching a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Robert Rivera sat in the front row with Carmen, both of them holding hands tightly, trying to prepare for whatever outcome. Thomas Cooper sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, Patricia having been unable to face attending the verdict. Dylan sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. The jury foreman stood when asked if they had reached a verdict and confirmed they had. The clerk read the verdict aloud. In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Dylan Cooper, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Robert collapsed forward, sobbing with relief that there had been justice for Maria. Carmen put her arm around him while crying herself. Thomas Cooper sat stone-faced, showing no reaction, his son's fate now sealed. Dylan closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping, the reality of life in prison settling over him. The jury had rejected the defense's arguments completely. They found the evidence of premeditation convincing, from the burner phone to the parking location to the staging of the burglary. They found Dylan's testimony unbelievable, and they found that regardless of the complicated emotions involved, stabbing someone 17 times was not a crime of passion, but a deliberate choice to kill. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. In California, first-degree murder carries a sentence of 25 years to life. The prosecutor sought life without possibility of parole, arguing the brutality of the crime and lack of genuine remorse. The defense argued for the minimum 25 to life, citing Dylan's youth and lack of prior criminal record. The victim impact statements were devastating. Robert Rivera spoke about the effect of Maria's murder on their children, how Emily still could not sleep alone, how Joshua was failing school and getting in fights, how their family had been destroyed not just by losing Maria, but by the trauma of how she died. He spoke about his own grief, complicated by anger about the affair, but overwhelmed by sadness that Maria would never see her children grow up, would never meet her grandchildren, would never have the chance to fix the problems in their marriage. He spoke directly to Dylan, saying that whatever problems Maria had created by having an affair, she did not deserve to die, that no one deserves to be murdered for ending a relationship. Carmen Santos spoke about losing her sister, about the guilt she felt for not doing more to help Maria when she knew Maria was afraid. She spoke about their mother in the Philippines who would never recover from losing her eldest daughter so violently. She spoke about the impact on the extended family, on Maria's siblings and cousins and aunts and uncles who all felt the loss. Joshua Rivera, 14 years old, spoke briefly but powerfully. He said he was angry at his mother for having an affair, angry at her for bringing danger into their home, but that he missed her every day. He said Dylan had stolen his mother from him, had taken away the person he loved most, and that he would never forgive him for that. The judge, Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Wong, took all the victim impact statements into consideration. She noted that Dylan had shown limited remorse, had lied on the witness stand, and had attempted to blame Maria for her own death. She noted the extreme violence of the crime and the terror Maria must have experienced in her final minutes. Judge Wong sentenced Dylan Cooper to life in prison without possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available. She stated that Dylan had shown himself to be a danger to society, that his obsessive behavior and inability to accept rejection could lead to violence again if he were ever released. She stated that Maria Santos Rivera's life had value, that she was loved by her family and community, and that her mistakes did not justify her murder. The sentence meant Dylan would spend the rest of his life in prison, dying behind bars unless some future governor granted him clemency, which was unlikely given the nature of the crime. Dylan was 24 at sentencing. He would likely die in prison in his 70s or 80s, having spent the majority of his life paying for the few minutes of rage that ended Maria's life. After the sentencing, Robert Rivera stood on the courthouse steps and spoke to the gathered media. He said that while he was glad justice had been served, it did not bring Maria back. He said he hoped the case would serve as a warning to others about the dangers of affairs, the importance of recognizing obsessive behavior, and the need to take stalking and harassment seriously. He said he forgave Maria for her mistakes because everyone makes mistakes, but that did not mean he would ever forget what her choices had set in motion. He said his focus now was on helping his children heal and building a new life from the ashes of everything they had lost. The aftermath of Maria Santos Rivera's murder and Dylan Cooper's conviction extended far beyond the courtroom verdict. For the families directly involved, the ripple effects would last for generations. For Robert Rivera, the years following Maria's death were consumed with single-parenting two traumatized children while processing his own complicated grief. He eventually sold the house on Cypress Avenue, unable to bear living in the place where Maria had died. He moved with Joshua and Emily to a smaller home in a different neighborhood, starting fresh in a place without memories of the life they had lost. Robert never remarried. He threw himself into his work and his children, focusing all his energy on helping them heal and succeed. The anger he felt about Maria's affair faded over time, replaced by sadness about the state their marriage had been in, about the distance that had grown between them, about his own failings as a husband. He attended therapy and came to understand that while Maria had made terrible choices, so had he. His choice to prioritize work over family, to let emotional intimacy die in his marriage, to assume Maria was fine without actually checking. These choices had contributed to creating the conditions where Maria sought connection elsewhere. That understanding did not excuse Maria's affair or Dylan's violence, but it gave Robert a more complete picture of how tragedy happens, how small choices compound over time until something breaks catastrophically. Joshua Rivera struggled through his teenage years with anger, depression, and trust issues. He got into trouble at school, experimented with drugs and alcohol, pushed away people who tried to help him. His relationship with his father was strained, complicated by Robert's own emotional unavailability during those difficult years. But with intensive therapy and support, Joshua eventually found his way. He graduated high school, went to community college, and eventually became a counselor working with at-risk youth, channeling his own trauma into helping others. He never fully resolved his complicated feelings about his mother, the love and anger and grief existing in permanent tension. But he learned to live with that complexity rather than being destroyed by it. Maria Rivera's trauma manifested differently. She became anxious and hypervigilant, developing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that persisted into adulthood. She had difficulty trusting people, difficulty with intimate relationships, difficulty feeling safe. She required years of therapy to function, and even then she was plagued by nightmares and intrusive thoughts about her mother's death. Unlike Joshua, who became outwardly troubled, Emily became inwardly collapsed, a quiet, cautious person who never quite learned how to be fully present in her own life. She maintained a close relationship with her father, who was her anchor in a world that had proven itself unsafe and unpredictable. For Thomas and Patricia Cooper, the aftermath was equally devastating but in different ways. Their marriage, as mentioned, did not survive. The shame and grief were too much to bear together. Patricia blamed herself for raising a son who could commit murder, endlessly reviewing Dylan's childhood for signs she missed or mistakes she made. She became isolated, cutting off contact with most friends and family, living a small, quiet life defined by regret. Thomas was more pragmatic but no less damaged. He maintained minimal contact with Dylan in prison, occasional letters, but no visits, unable to reconcile the son he had raised with the man who had committed such violence. Thomas remarried eventually, seeking companionship in his later years, but he never spoke about Dylan to his new wife or her family, keeping that chapter of his life sealed off and separate. Dylan's siblings, the two older children who had already moved out and started their own families, essentially cut Dylan out of their lives completely. They changed their last name to distance themselves from the notoriety of the case. They did not visit Dylan in prison, did not write to him, did not acknowledge his existence. When their friends or colleagues asked if they had siblings, they said they had one sibling, not two. To them, Dylan had died the day he murdered Maria. The brother they had known no longer existed, replaced by a stranger they wanted nothing to do with. For Dylan Cooper himself, prison life was difficult, but not as dangerous as it could have been. Inmates generally do not respect people who kill women, but Dylan was young, kept his head down, and found ways to survive. He worked in the prison library, took college courses through a correspondence program, and tried to avoid trouble. In his first years in prison, he maintained some delusion that he had been wrongly convicted or excessively sentenced, that he was the victim of an unjust system. But over time, that delusion became harder to maintain. He could not escape the reality of what he had done, the brutality of his actions, the terror Maria must have felt. In letters to his father, which Thomas rarely answered, Dylan expressed remorse, though it was unclear if that remorse was genuine or performative. He wrote about understanding now that he had been obsessed, that he had not been thinking clearly, that he should have walked away instead of letting rejection drive him to violence. But words of remorse do not undo a murder. They do not bring Maria back. They do not heal the trauma inflicted on her family. They are, at best, a first step toward Dylan taking responsibility for the horror he caused, and at worst, a manipulation to garner sympathy. The broader impact of Maria's case extended beyond the immediate families. The murder became a case study used in psychology and criminology courses, examining obsessive relationships and violence stemming from rejected attachment. Researchers analyzed the progression from affair to stalking to murder, identifying warning signs that might help others recognize dangerous situations earlier. Domestic violence advocacy groups used Maria's story in educational programs, emphasizing that domestic violence can come from any intimate relationship, not just marriages, and that stalking and harassment should always be taken seriously as potential precursors to violence. Maria's case also sparked conversations in immigrant communities about the particular pressures faced by women caught between traditional cultural expectations and modern American life. Filipino-American community organizations held forums discussing mental health, relationship problems, and resources available to people struggling with isolation and loneliness. The Catholic Church, where Maria had been so active, began offering marriage counseling and support groups for couples experiencing difficulties, recognizing that the silence and shame around marital problems can lead people to make dangerous choices rather than seeking help. The case influenced law enforcement approaches to stalking and harassment complaints. After Maria's murder, the LAPD implemented new training for officers on recognizing patterns of obsessive behavior and taking threats seriously even when they are not explicitly violent. Maria had never reported Dylan's harassment to police, partly from shame about the affair and partly from fear of not being believed. But even if she had reported it, pre-Maria's murder, officers might have dismissed it as a domestic dispute between adults. Post-Maria's murder, there was greater awareness that stalking often escalates to violence and that restraining orders and police intervention can be life-saving. At the California state level, Maria's case was cited during legislative debates about expanding stalking laws and enhancing penalties for violations of restraining orders. While Maria's story was not the only factor, it contributed to a broader conversation about protecting victims of obsessive harassment before that harassment turns deadly. 10 years after Maria's death, Robert Rivera published a book about his experience, titled After Maria, A Widower's Journey Through Grief and Forgiveness. The book was brutally honest about the state of his marriage, about his failures as a husband, about Maria's affair, and about the murder. Robert did not portray Maria as perfect or himself as blameless. He wrote about the complicated emotions of loving someone, losing them, and then discovering they had betrayed you, all while trying to honor their memory for children who needed to believe their mother loved them. The book received positive reviews and helped many people dealing with complicated grief. Robert donated all proceeds to organizations supporting children who had lost parents to violence. Carmen Santos, Maria's sister, became active in victim advocacy, working with families who had lost loved ones to murder. She spoke at conferences and workshops about the importance of supporting families through the criminal justice process, which can be re-traumatizing and difficult. She also spoke about the importance of not judging victims based on their choices, emphasizing that having an affair does not make someone responsible for their own murder. That judgment of victims only serves to isolate them and make them less likely to seek help when they are in danger. The neighborhood of Cypress Park slowly healed, though the memory of what happened lingered. New families moved into the houses that had belonged to the Riveras and the Coopers, unaware of the history at first, but eventually learning from neighbors who had been there. The story became part of the neighborhood's oral history, a cautionary tale told to newcomers, a reminder that terrible things can happen anywhere, that the peaceful facade of suburban life can conceal darkness. Some residents moved away, unable to feel safe after learning their neighbor had committed murder. Others stayed, determined not to let fear dictate their lives. The Filipino-American community in Los Angeles eventually absorbed Maria's story into its collective memory. She was remembered at annual community events, her name mentioned among those lost too soon. The church where she had been so active dedicated a small memorial garden in her honor, a place for people to sit and reflect. Every year on the anniversary of her death, friends and family gathered there to remember not the affair or the murder, but the woman Maria had been before tragedy defined her life and death. As for the larger questions raised by Maria's case, what drives people to have affairs, how obsession becomes violence, whether tragedy could have been prevented, these questions had no simple answers. Experts could analyze and explain, but at the end of the day, Maria made choices, Dylan made choices, and those choices led to a murder that destroyed multiple families. Could things have been different if Robert had been more present in his marriage? If Maria had been more honest about her unhappiness? If Dylan had sought help for his mental health? If Maria had reported his harassment to police? Maybe. Or maybe the same tragedy would have unfolded differently, but with the same devastating result. The human capacity for self-deception, for rationalization, for making catastrophically bad decisions while believing we are doing the right thing, is nearly infinite. People make mistakes. Some mistakes are small and easily corrected. Others, like Maria having an affair with an unstable young man, or Dylan believing he owned someone he could not have, these mistakes compound and cascade until they end in violence that can never be undone. The lesson, if there is one, is not that people should never make mistakes. That is impossible. The lesson is that when we feel ourselves making choices we know are wrong, when we see warning signs that someone is becoming obsessed or dangerous, when isolation and loneliness drive us toward harmful connections, we need to stop, seek help, talk to people we trust, and change course before small bad choices become irreversible tragedies. Maria did not deserve to die. No one deserves to be murdered for ending a relationship, for making poor choices, for being human and flawed. Dylan made the choice to take a knife and stab another human being 17 times. That choice was his alone, and no amount of emotional pain or feeling of betrayal justified that violence. But we can also recognize that the path to that kitchen floor on that December morning was paved with smaller choices, missed opportunities, unspoken truths, and unaddressed problems that accumulated until they exploded into horror. Years after the trial, after the appeals had been exhausted and Dylan's conviction was final, Robert Rivera did something that shocked people who knew the case. He wrote a letter to Dylan in prison, not to forgive him, not to absolve him, but to tell him about Emily and Joshua, about how they were slowly healing, about the kind of young adults they were becoming despite the trauma they carried. He wrote about Maria, about the woman she had been before the affair, about her kindness and her warmth and her love for her children. He wrote about the hole her death had left in the world, the absence that would never be filled, and he wrote to Dylan about choices, about how one moment of violence had destroyed so many lives, his own included, and how Dylan would have to live with that for the rest of his life. Robert never received a response, and he did not expect one. The letter was not about Dylan. It was about Robert himself, about his own process of releasing anger and moving toward acceptance of a reality he could not change. Some people criticized Robert for writing to Dylan, seeing it as a betrayal of Maria's memory. But Robert explained that carrying anger and hatred was destroying him from the inside, that he needed to release it to continue living, that forgiveness was not about Dylan deserving it, but about Robert freeing himself from the prison of permanent rage. 20 years after Maria's death, Emily Rivera, now in her early 30s, gave birth to her first child, a daughter she named Maria, in honor of the grandmother her daughter would never meet. It was a healing choice, a way of bringing something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, a way of ensuring that the name Maria Santos Rivera would be associated not just with murder, but with life and love and continuation. Joshua attended the baptism with his father Robert, now in his 60s, and slowing down but present and proud. They stood together, 3 generations connected by love and loss. And for a moment the weight of the past seemed to lift just enough to allow gratitude for what remained and hope for what was yet to come. Maria Santos Rivera's story did not end with her death. It continued in the lives she touched, in the lessons drawn from her tragedy, in the changes made to prevent similar deaths, in the children and grandchildren who carried her name and her memory forward. She was more than a victim. more than an affair, more than a statistic in crime databases. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend. She made mistakes and paid for them with her life. She deserved better than the end she got. All victims of violence deserve better, and while justice was served in the form of Dylan Cooper spending his life in prison, true justice would have been Maria getting the chance to learn from her mistakes, to repair her marriage, or leave it honestly, to watch her children grow up, to become a grandmother, to live a full life and die peacefully decades from now, surrounded by people who loved her. That chance was stolen from her by a man who believed his feelings entitled him to her life. The cautionary lessons from Maria Rivera's murder remain relevant as long as people struggle with loneliness, as long as marriages fail through neglect, as long as people make bad choices about who they trust, and as long as rejected love can turn to rage. Her story is a tragedy, but it is also a warning, a call to recognize danger before it strikes, to value what we have before we lose it, to communicate honestly instead of hiding in secrets, and to understand that violence is never the answer to heartbreak. May Maria's memory be a blessing to those who loved her, a lesson to those who study her case, and a reminder to all of us that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we can never fully anticipate, affecting not just ourselves, but everyone connected to us. In remembering Maria, we honor not just her life, but all the lives touched by violence, all the families destroyed by murder, all the victims whose stories deserve to be told with respect and honesty. This is Maria's story, a story of human frailty, terrible choices, obsessive love, and ultimate violence. But it is also a story of survival, of justice, of healing, and of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. And in that resilience, in that determination to continue living and loving, despite grief and trauma, there is hope that even from the darkest tragedies, something meaningful can emerge.